It's funny that I started this series talking about the Parish, the final chapter of Left 4 Dead's story, and now, 7 videos later, I get the chance to talk about the campaign that started it all. No Mercy remains a fan favorite amongst the community. Just like with Dead Center, this campaign had the job of setting the tone and establishing its characters, and No Mercy did its job to near perfection. 4 players or versus mode, it doesn't really matter. No Mercy is a fantastic campaign for nearly any game mode. Without wasting any more time, let's break down the story behind No Mercy. Before we get started with the actual campaign, I wanted to do a quick breakdown on the intro cinematic for Left 4 Dead 1. Not only is it the first ever cutscene in this series, it also takes place literally minutes before the start of the No Mercy campaign, so let's quickly break down this intro cinematic. After walking up an alley, Bill notices something strange and decides to investigate, which leads to this exchange with Francis.
Ain't seen anything like this before.
Jesus, don't let that stop you from smearing it all over yourself.
They're changing.
God damn it, Bill! Oh, it stinks!
For those who may not have noticed, this is boomer bile. We know this for sure because shortly after wiping the bile on Francis, the survivors get attacked by a small swarm of infected. Also, keep in mind what Bill said.
They're changing.
God!
And Bill is absolutely right. The infected are in fact mutating over the course of only 2 weeks, and it's obvious that the survivors up to this point have little to no experience fighting the special infected, which is pretty much confirmed a few seconds later, when the survivors hear the cryings of a witch and don't immediately run in the other direction. Zoe and Bill investigate, and after finding out the witch does in fact not need any help, Lewis storms in with a flashlight and pisses her off. This starts off an action scene where we get a look at how the pipe bomb works, and we get our first ever looks at the smoker and the hunter. And shortly after that, the survivors come face to face with a tank. This scene is just so goddamn cool. Remember, this came out in 2008. The survivors flee to a nearby alley and climb a fire escape to get away from the zombies. This exact fire escape can be seen blocking the alley once you leave the apartment. And after taking a short break, the survivors hear a helicopter flying overhead, telling them to go to Mercy Hospital. And now with all that out of the way, let's officially start breaking down No Mercy. Right before entering the subway, if you walk down the street, you'll find a partially collapsed building blocking the road. Considering the size of the building, I don't think this was done by a special infected. It would take a big explosion to bring a piece of it down. In theory, it could have been a lot of things, but if I had to take a bet, this could have been a bomb dropped by the military. It's implied in both wall graffiti and dialogue that the military has been bombing cities all over Pennsylvania. Like I said, I don't know for sure, but we'll come to find more evidence of military bombings the further we get into Left 4 Dead's story. For now, let's move on to the wall graffiti found in Chapter 2. Radio is saying Fairfield has been quarantined. Sarah, Jen is fine. Meet us at Riverside. Aaron. Entire city is gone. If you can read this, leave. At the start of Chapter 2, the survivors arrive at the destroyed subway tunnels. Just to serve as a quick reminder, with this campaign being the first ever in Left 4 Dead's history, the survivor dialogue is not nearly as fleshed out and, in my opinion, not nearly as entertaining as the dialogue interactions from Left 4 Dead 2. However, that doesn't mean there isn't some funny interactions. For example, the Left 4 Dead 1 survivors have easily the best friendly fire dialogue.
Ow! You having some kind of flashback, old man?
Go on! Do it one more time, fat man!
And for those who may not know, Zoe is a massive fan of horror movies, and will sometimes make a reference to horror classics like Aliens and Evil Dead.
Groovy. Game over, man! Game over!
And here's a funny back and forth between Francis and Bill.
We've been immune so far, but, well, if I start to turn, promise you'll shoot me.
What if just your beard starts to turn? Can I shoot that?
Speak up, Francis. Your voice got all muffled from your head being so far up your ass.
This next audio bit is probably my favorite voice line from Lewis.
If I go down, go on without me. Actually, wait, no. Save my ass.
Moving on to the start of Chapter 3, the survivors arrive at a pawn shop, and inside we have some more wall graffiti. Nobody is coming to save us. They are going to bomb the city. Get out. Nobody is going to save us. Heather, ignore the plan. Airport is quarantined. Meet me at Mom's. Rick. At the start of Chapter 3, the survivors cut through a burger tank, and yes, this is the same burger tank seen in the finale of Hard Rain. Shortly after, the survivors have to cut through a warehouse using a lift to get on the roof. Depending on the game mode you're playing, this is one of the hardest events in the game. Whenever I play versus mode on No Mercy, team wipes happen here all the time, and I can only imagine how much harder it is on expert difficulty. After cutting through the warehouse, the survivors find multiple dead bodies, and sometimes Bill will say this.
Looks like people went this way.
Shortly after, the survivors arrive at the sewers, thinking it would be the fastest way to get to the hospital. Upon entering the sewers, you'll sometimes get this dialogue between the survivors.
The subway smelled bad, but this...
Francis, is that you or the sewer?
Moving on to the end of Chapter 3, the survivors officially arrive at Mercy Hospital, and there is a lot of ground to cover in Chapters 4 and 5. Before going any further, let's break down some wall graffiti. Mercy Hospital is overrun. John, I'm safe. I got out and I'm traveling with good people. They are immune too. We are going to find a supermarket and fortify it. We will hide until the army comes. I love you, Sharon. I killed 63, 77, 86, 104, 109, bitches. 53,595. Lies. That final number is a reference to the infamous Dead Rising achievement Zombie Genocider, which is rewarded after killing exactly 53,594 zombies. And it should also be noted that Left 4 Dead 2 has an achievement that's very similar to Zombie Genocider, but this time it's rewarded after killing 53,599 zombies. And if you open up your calculator and take 53,599 and subtract it by 53,595, the answer you get is 4, which is yet another reference to the number 4 seen in Left 4 Dead's title. Before you even leave the safe room, sometimes you'll get this dialogue between the survivors.
So, yeah.
Were they saving people or killing them?
When walking through Mercy Hospital, it's important to note that the lights are still working and the computers are still on. It's entirely possible that the survivors who did hold out at Mercy Hospital died hours, maybe even minutes before the Left 4 Dead crew's arrival. However, most, if not all, hospitals are equipped with emergency generators, so remember, we don't know for sure. And since we're already knee-deep in the No Mercy rabbit hole, here are a few more things that we need to break down. In the Sacrifice comic, we see Bill before the outbreak at a hospital waiting for a surgery. Some people have speculated that this surgery takes place at Mercy Hospital, but I don't think this is true for 2 reasons. 1, at the start of this flashback, we see the outline of the hospital where Bill is, and it looks nothing like Mercy Hospital, not to mention the name, Veterans Hospital. I suppose it's possible that Bill was transferred to Mercy Hospital for his surgery and we simply didn't see it, but that brings me to reason number 2. After Bill escapes his surgery, he runs into a hallway, and these tiled floors are nowhere to be found in Mercy Hospital. Again, I don't know with 100% certainty, but I'm willing to bet that Bill was in fact not getting his surgery at Mercy Hospital. But before we move on, there's one more thing that deserves a mention. Mercy Hospital makes an appearance in the game Payday. In fact, the layout of this mission matches the layout from Left 4 Dead 1 almost perfectly. And if you're wondering what the Payday crew was doing at Mercy Hospital, they were extracting blood from infected patients. Yeah, you can probably see where this is going. And at the start of this heist, if you look behind you, you can see Bill standing in the elevator. However, it's important to note that this is more likely than not an Easter egg that isn't canon to Left 4 Dead's story. So with that out of the way, let's finally talk about the elevator ride, which comes with some dialogue for us.
I can't get over how fast they all are. It's not even fair. I'm calling zombie bullshit on that, you know? They're not allowed to be so fast.
You call this a zombie apocalypse? Don't hold a candle to the great zombie attack of 57. Nah, I'm horseshitting you.
Where the hell did all these vampires come from?
They ain't vampires, man. They're zombies.
Yeah, whatever you say, Professor Monster.
The final stretch of Chapter 4 is a prime spot for death charges. In 4 players, you'll be fine, but in versus mode, this is a very dangerous spot for the survivors, and it's even worse when you get the tank spawn up here. Now, moving on to the beginning of Chapter 5, where we have some more graffiti to break down. It takes at least 4 days to change. No, it doesn't. 3 days. 2.5 hours. I saw it happen in 5 minutes. I promise I will go into more detail on this in a few minutes, but for now, I want to go over the rest of the graffiti. No zombie is safe from Chicago Ted. On the wall next to the graffiti is an infection warning left by Sita, which reads as follows. If you think you are infected, remain calm. Quarantine yourself from the uninfected population immediately. Do not attempt to contact friends or family. Contact a contamination facility for immediate screening. Upon arriving at the rooftop, the survivors find a radio and use it to contact the helicopter pilot. This finale is again one of the best finales in the game, at least in my opinion. The rooftop is filled with supplies and good vantage points, but if you're playing on versus mode, you are at risk of an instant death throughout the whole duration of the finale. Death charges are one thing, but once the tank rolls in, try and stay in the center of the roof to the best of your ability. Remember, good infected teams will do their best to force you to the edge and set up a death charge. So if you're playing versus on this finale, be sure to move with caution. After fighting off the infected hordes, the pilot arrives and rescues the survivors. Now, after digging through the files, I found some deleted audio clips for the helicopter pilot. Here's a few of them.
Saw you get hit. Are you immune? Just tried a street pickup. I should know better. I think I got hit. Can you grab me a first aid kit? I am getting really cold.
Now, let's recall the wall graffiti found in the beginning of the finale. This is where I have to put on the speculation cap because this next question has almost no definitive answer. Spoiler alert for those who may not know, it's revealed in Crash Course that the pilot turned into a zombie, just like almost all the other pilots in this franchise. Here comes the difficult question though. Did the pilot turn because he got bit during a supposed street pickup, or because of his proximity to the survivors? Well, if I had to guess, it was likely during the street pickup. Not only does the pilot bring up an incident that happened over the radio, but there's a voice line of the helicopter pilot turning into a zombie. Again, I don't know for sure, but regardless of the reason, this guy was fucked either way. Maybe it was a combination of being bit and the pilot's proximity to the survivors that drastically sped up the turning process. But again, that's just speculation. Pilots really do have it bad in this franchise. And that concludes the story behind No Mercy. Once again, thank you for being patient with me. Up next we got Crash Course, and after that, we've only got 3 campaigns left. If I missed anything, be sure to let me know. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. We're back with another campaign breakdown, and up next we have, in my opinion, the worst campaign in Left 4 Dead 2. Crash Course is about as bad as it gets from a gameplay perspective. It's only 2 chapters long, and those 2 chapters are about as boring as it gets. With the exception of the howitzer found in Chapter 1, this campaign does nothing interesting. If I had to give this campaign any sort of credit, the wall graffiti and dialogue interactions are among the best in Left 4 Dead 1. Without wasting any more time, let's break down the story behind Crash Course. Very shortly after the events of No Mercy, the survivors crash at a nearby city. After checking the wiki, this city is named Whitney County, which is a real city found in Pennsylvania. At the start of the campaign, you'll sometimes get this back and forth between the survivors.
I still can't believe you shot the pilot.
He turned into a zombie, Francis. He wasn't gonna land the thing.
Not only does this mirror the beginning of Swamp Fever almost to a T, it should also be noted that of all the people in that helicopter, Zoe was the one to pull the trigger. Not the biker, not the war vet, Zoe, the youngest of the 4 survivors. And if you're extra lucky, Zoe will sometimes say this at the start of the campaign.
Pilot's license revoked.
Zoe shooting the pilot becomes a running joke in this campaign, and Francis is sure to bring it up whenever he gets the chance.
How many pilots have you shot, Zoe? Rough ballpark guess.
Francis and Lewis will also have this exchange.
Hey, Lewis, that fancy college of yours teach you how to fix a helicopter?
That's funny, Francis. Why don't you take your mustache, your little vest, and your chaps and go find yourself a parade?
Another thing that should be noted before moving on is the name of this campaign. Crash Course, according to the Cambridge Dictionary, is a series of lessons that teach you a lot of basic facts or skills in a very short amount of time. A very fitting name considering that Crash Course, as mentioned earlier, is the shortest campaign in the Left 4 Dead series. And after digging through the wiki, it turns out that this was an intentional design choice. Valve thought the shorter levels would result in a more intense game of versus, which is, kind of funny, because even all the way back then, not a lot of people were playing this campaign. But that's enough slander for now, let's get back on track. One thing that I noticed while walking through this campaign is the sheer amount of dead soldiers and abandoned military vehicles. You see these throughout Left 4 Dead's story, sure, but it's noticeably cranked up in Crash Course. This could be related to the military outposts found later on, or it was simply a failed evacuation which resulted in the deaths of military personnel. We'll talk more about the military outposts with the howitzer very soon, but for now, let's keep talking about Chapter 1. Shortly after leaving the crash site, the survivors cut through a warehouse, and if you walk into a room on the left, you find a room with some wall graffiti that reads as follows. The army left a howitzer behind. The alleys are safer. No, they aren't. 5 of my buddies died back here today. Angels of death. Brenda, Jerry, Chris, Phil, Sean, Brock, Jason. World's coming to an end and they're drawing pictures. And for those wondering, the tally marks add up to a grand total of 660. The name Sean makes an appearance in the Last Stand campaign as well. His graffiti reads as follows. I am the last one here. Thank you to those who got me this far. Sean. Neat Easter egg, but remember that the Last Stand is not canon. After cutting through the warehouse, if you look at the side of the building, you'll see the name Hirsch Shipping, and sometimes you'll get this line from Francis.
I drove for Hirsch once, till some guy laughed at my little brown shorts, and I beat him to death.
This also isn't the first time the survivors cut through a warehouse belonging to Hirsch. In Chapter 3 of No Mercy, a warehouse can be found with the exact same company name. Now, moving on. Shortly after, the survivors come across a barricade. Considering the sandbags, the spotlights, and the writing on the doors, it's safe to assume that this barricade was set up by the military. And when you eventually reach the other side, you find more military vehicles, more dead soldiers, and a working howitzer. On the right of the barricade, you can find a piece of paper listing off the locations of CETA evacuation centers. Half the page is torn, but thankfully, this same piece of paper can be found on the wall undamaged in Chapter 2, and we will break this down in due time. But for now, let's talk about the howitzer. Aside from the finale, this is the only other event in this campaign, and here comes the obvious question. Why bring a howitzer to this outpost? Considering that the howitzer is already loaded and aimed towards the bridge, my best guess is that the military brought the howitzer to strengthen the defense of their outposts. At this stage of the outbreak, the military was likely aware of the special infected and had to take more extreme measures to bolster their defenses. A howitzer shell does sound like an effective weapon against something like a tank, but keep in mind that's just speculation. Before moving on, it should also be noted that right above this outpost is a destroyed train, and sometimes you'll get this back and forth between Francis and Zoe.
Whoa! Zoe must have shot the train conductor.
Okay, you know what? He was a zombie. Zombie. Not a pilot. He was a zombie, Francis.
Right next to the howitzer, you can find a building with a for lease sign, and sometimes you get this dialogue between Francis and Lewis.
For lease.
I'll be damned, Francis! When'd you learn to read?
Also, when you fire the howitzer, sometimes Francis will say this.
Here they come! Zoe! Just pretend they're all helicopter pilots!
Zombie, Francis. He was a zombie!
After walking up the bridge, the survivors see a highway sign saying Riverside, and once you reach the safe room, you'll sometimes get this back and forth between Zoe and Francis.
Riverside? I hate Canada. If there's one thing I hate more than vampires, it's Canada, eh?
Canada? Francis, we're in Pennsylvania.
Man, I've been hating Riverside all this time for nothing.
Yeah, Canadians are dicks.
And sometimes Francis will say this after he hears a boomer or a hunter.
I hear a boomer! And it sounded Canadian. Hunter! It looked Canadian.
Now, moving past the unnecessary Canada slander, let's move on to Chapter 2. We have some more wall graffiti to break down, but there's something that we have to talk about first. On the wall behind a table, you find a map, similar to the one found in Chapter 1 of Dead Center, showing the locations of military outposts. Most of these outposts have an X written on them except for two, the Northeastern Safety Zone and the South Safety Zone. The South Safety Zone is of course located in New Orleans. As for the Northeastern Safety Zone, I'm almost positive that this is Fort Millhaven. At this point in the story, Fort Millhaven is still active and taking in survivors, not to mention it's consistent with the location of Blood Harvest. Before moving on, there's another thing that should be noted. The X's on this map may not be 100% accurate because if you look at the bottom right, you find another safety zone located in Georgia with an X over it. I'm almost positive that this safety zone is the Vanna Hotel seen in the beginning of Dead Center. Dead Center does take place in Georgia, and the Vanna Hotel was used by the military as an evacuation center. But if this is true, why is it scratched out? At this point in the story, the Vanna Hotel should be fine. This is another point where I don't have a 100% confident answer. The X seems to suggest that the events of Dead Center already happened, and the Vanna Hotel is overrun, but at this point in the story, the Left 4 Dead 2 survivors haven't even met yet. I might do a future video talking about the timeline because once again, I'm about to jump into a massive rabbit hole and I don't want to go off track. Overall point is, I don't think this map is 100% accurate, but it's important to note that these green circles are consistent with the locations of Dead Center, the Parish, and the Sacrifice comic. On the right of the map, we have another piece of paper left by CETA. This is the piece of paper I showed earlier, but this time we can see the bottom half of the page. Now we can see the names of these locations. From top to bottom, we have Mercy Hospital, Fairfield Arena, Borden High School, and Riverside First Church. And yes, I'm almost positive that this is the same church seen in Death Toll. If you look at the map, the church can be found all the way to the left, and at the top of the map you can see the name Riverside, which is of course the location of the Death Toll campaign. Also, if you look at this map, you may have noticed that the church and Mercy Hospital are surprisingly close together. Based on this, it's safe to assume that the survivors didn't get very far in the helicopter, further implying that the pilot turned very fast after picking up the survivors. Now, with all that out of the way, let's break down some wall graffiti. Peter, Army's still in Riverside, waiting for you at the depot. We finished the truck. Hurry. Karen and I are holed up in a recycling plant, have plenty of food and water. Look for the hollow container. I love you. Jason. P.S. Don't tell Allison. Jonathan, you have touched my very being. I shall remember you. You taught all that knew you what courage meant and have... Okay, seriously, what the fuck is this sentence? I shall remember you. You taught all that knew you what courage meant, and have shown us an example in death as you did in life. God give me strength in my life without you, and I shall thank her. I can only hope that our souls shall entwine again in a place where there is only love. No tears, no sadness, no cruelty, no white, no black, no zombies, no hate, no war. Only love, only love. Allison. P.S. I'm fat. Go back to poetry school. Jesus, lady, I'm hiding from zombies, and reading this was the most terrible thing to happen to me today. Allison, roses are red, violets are blue, you suck. Allison, reading your poem ruined heaven. Thanks a lot. Jonathan's ghost. In Chapter 2, before you reach the depot, the survivors will walk past a billboard, and sometimes you'll get this dialogue between the survivors.
Funny, sexy brunette zombie killer wanted to lead 3 helpless men to safety. Huh.
The sign says, I hate Mondays. Man, tell me about it.
The truck referenced in the wall graffiti earlier can be found in the finale of Crash Course. Before talking about this finale from a gameplay perspective, we have a few things to break down. First of all, this truck, along with the art design on the front, is likely a reference to Dawn of the Dead, which also features an armored vehicle with a similar design. And if you look behind the truck, you find 2 dead bodies, one with a radio. No way to know for sure, but these were likely the survivors mentioned in the wall graffiti in Chapter 2. The truck they were working on is still here, and more importantly, it works. Either the survivors died or fled the depot, but regardless of the reason, the truck was left behind for the survivors to take. But first they need to power the generator to lower the truck. This finale sucks, and I have almost nothing good to say about it. The generator turning off is clearly foreshadowing the finale of the sacrifice, so I guess there's that, but from a gameplay perspective, this finale does pretty much nothing interesting. After the truck lowers, the survivors pile in and head straight for Riverside, and that concludes the story behind Crash Course. As I mentioned earlier, this is the worst campaign in my opinion, but on the lore side, it's pretty good, considering it's only 2 chapters long. Up next we have Death Toll, and after that we only have 2 campaigns to go. If I missed anything, be sure to let me know down below. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one. 3 campaigns left to go, and up next, we have one of the best campaigns the first game has to offer. Death Toll is a very solid campaign, and I have almost no bad things to say about it. Once again, no matter what game mode you're playing, Death Toll is a very strong pick. Not only that, this campaign is one of the hardest in the series, with 3 brutal events that put an end to most expert runs. On the gameplay side, it's very solid, but on the lore side, there is a lot to talk about. So without wasting any more time, let's break down the story behind Death Toll. After the events of Crash Course, the survivors are stopped in the road by a massive rubble pile. At the start of this campaign, if you turn around, you can see the truck from Crash Course behind the pile of rubble. And if you look in front of the squad car seen in the beginning, you find a sign saying this. And for those wondering, Riverside is in fact a real city in Pennsylvania. The survivors talk about a military holdout in Riverside, which they most likely heard about from the graffiti and CETA papers found in Chapter 2 of Crash Course. After walking a short distance, the survivors come across a tunnel. According to the wiki, this tunnel is based on the abandoned Pennsylvania Turnpike. Once the survivors reach the end of the tunnel, they discover that it's blocked, and are forced to take a different route to Riverside. Once you reach the end of Chapter 1, that's where we start to get a lot more story implications. The safe room in Chapter 2 has a lot to break down. Before we get started on the wall graffiti, we have a few things to go over. First of all, we have 2 maps. They look the same, but they're showing different locations. If you look close enough, you can see names on this map, but they are incredibly difficult to read. If I had to give it my best guess, this is likely the Allegheny National Forest where the Blood Harvest campaign takes place. A very similar map can be found in the finale of Blood Harvest, and considering the sheer amount of rivers and railroads seen on the map, a forest is the most likely location. On the left of the map, you find a whiteboard, which shows you the entire layout of Chapter 2. Now with that out of the way, let's talk about the wall graffiti. October 2nd, Johnny killed 12 infected with his bare hands. October 4th, Johnny was killed in friendly fire. 12 tally marks can be seen right next to the graffiti. We'll talk more about this later, but for now we're going to move on. Exodus 9:15. This is obviously a reference to Exodus, the second book of the Bible, and the 9:15 is referring to chapter 9, verse 15, which reads as follows. For by now I should have stretched out my hand and struck you and your people with such pestilence that you would have vanished from the earth. While walking through chapter 2, you may have noticed that the sewers are falling apart. Piles of rubble and collapsed ceilings are littered throughout the early parts of this campaign. And when you throw that on top of the hundreds of zombies wandering in the sewers, it's an early sign that Riverside has been overrun. And just like with Mercy Hospital, the survivors arrived hours, maybe even minutes before Riverside succumbed to the infected. We'll go into more detail on that in due time, but for now, let's break down the wall graffiti found in the beginning of chapter 3. Claude Huggins, you are a coward and you let children die. Where is the army? All dead. They're around, they just pulled back. Riverside, overrun. Newburgh, overrun. The army's not coming back. Get out. Stay away from the ones that cry. I saw one rip apart 10 people. Listen for them and walk around. No, sneak up behind them, and if it doesn't hear you coming, it's a sitting duck. You go ahead, sneaking works for me. I can kill anybody I like, psycho. At the start of Chapter 3, at the top of a tower, you find tally marks that add up to 54, most likely a sniper counting his infected kills. And once you hit the road, there are two things that are worth pointing out. First, you find this sign saying Riverside. The town once had a population of 3,450. Secondly, a bus can be found on fire, and when you look at the front, you can see the name Valley Church. Before we start talking about the church, there is one more thing that's worth a mention. If you walk past the entrance to the graveyard, you find another barricade, with spotlights and barbed wire. Clearly a military barricade. And at the start of Chapter 4, you can walk to the other side of this barricade by walking down the street. If you look on the left of the barricade, you can find a street sign saying Welcome to Riverside, with the word Hell messily written over it. Now with that out of the way, let's finally talk about the church. There is a lot to break down here, so we're going to get the smaller stuff out of the way before we get to the big lore implications. First of all, you can actually play the piano found in the middle of the church. Simply press the E key, or X depending on the console you're playing. Secondly, if you walk into a room on the side, you find another map, similar to the one found in Chapter 2. And this isn't the last time I'll be showing you this kind of map. Thirdly, the church guy is voiced by Nathan Vetterline, who also voices the scout from Team Fortress 2. Also, this isn't the only Left 4 Dead NPC voiced by a TF2 character. The comments were quick to point out in the No Mercy video that the helicopter pilot was voiced by Dennis Bateman, who also voices the Pyro and the Spy. And finally, this church is mounted with spotlights, sandbags by the entrance, and the map mentioned earlier, meaning this church was likely used by the military as an outpost or evacuation center. Now with that out of the way, let's get to the first thing that's worth talking about. Before you even knock on the door, you can hear the church guy talking to himself, and a few of his lines give us some very useful information.
Better safe than sorry. I can't believe he bit me. I never should have let him in. It's been an hour. Like, must be immune. That's right. It must be immune. No, I have to be immune.
There is a lot to break down here. First of all, this guy was supposedly bitten only 1 hour ago by a total stranger, once again implying that the survivors arrived at Riverside right before the town fell to the infection. Secondly, at the end of this segment, the church guy turns into a zombie. This gives us a rough idea on how long it takes to turn into a zombie after getting bit, which is 1 hour. But with that in mind, let's recall the helicopter pilot at the end of No Mercy. Now, we don't know exactly how long it took for the pilot to turn, but what we do know is that it didn't take very long. Let's recall this map found in Crash Course. This is Mercy Hospital, and this is the church seen in Chapter 3 of Death Toll. If the survivors crashed closer to Riverside, they would have just walked there, but instead they decided to take a truck, directly implying that the survivors are still a fair distance away from Riverside. Overall point is, while we don't know exactly how long it took for the pilot to turn into a zombie, we know they didn't get very far from Mercy Hospital. Now I must admit, the helicopter pilot has a lot more outside factors leading to his transformation into a zombie. Without getting too deep into it, the helicopter pilot was bit or scratched by an infected prior to picking up the survivors. This is likely the reason why the helicopter pilot turned so quickly. Not only was he hit by an infected, standing next to 4 carriers likely sped up the turning process, but keep in mind that's just speculation. Here's a good question for the comment section though. Let's hypothetically say you're in the Left 4 Dead universe and you wanted to turn into a zombie. What would be the fastest and most efficient method? Simply getting bit or being in close proximity to a carrier? This is a question for a different video, but the overall point is, thanks to this line of dialogue from the church guy, we have a general idea of how long it takes to turn into a zombie after being bit. But keep in mind that most of this is just speculation. Because of the church guy's unhinged and deranged mental state, that 1 hour time frame given to us could have been exaggerated or simply incorrect. Regardless, it's very useful information on how the infection works in the Left 4 Dead universe. Now, moving on. If you look around the church, you'll notice the sheer amount of graffiti on the walls. This is very similar to the memorial wall found in Swamp Fever, but this time it's way bigger with a lot more names. Just to name off the interesting bits. Phil Robb, died October 15th, 2009. Fought like a demon, died like a man. Rest in peace, Phil. Brianna, Alex, 13th of October. They can't get to you now. It should also be noted that this memorial wall is not limited to just humans. A memorial for a dog named Penny could also be found. Another thing that should be noted are the dates written on the wall. When looking at the dates of these people's deaths, you can actually pin down a bit of a timeline. If you remember the wall graffiti found in Chapter 2, it says that on October 2nd, some crazy son of a bitch named Johnny killed 12 infected with his bare hands. Based on this, it's safe to assume that the infection hit Riverside on October 2nd. Now with that in mind, let's go back to the church. When you look at these people's date of deaths, one thing remains consistent. They all died sometime between October 2nd and October 17th. The wall graffiti in Chapter 2 is the earliest recorded sighting of the infected in Riverside, and while looking at the names on the wall, I couldn't find a date of death later than October 17th. Based on this, we can assume that the following is true. 1. The events of death toll take place sometime after October 17th. 2. The town of Riverside and its residents held off the infected for at least 16 days. That's over 2 weeks. It's also important to note that by all accounts, the special infected didn't start showing up until 2 weeks after the first infection. The zombies mutating into special infected was likely the final nail in the coffin for Riverside and its residents. Now with all that out of the way, let's go over even more of the church guy's dialogue.
We're cops! Open up!
You don't sound like cops!
Son, we're immune, we're tired, and there's infected in the damn woods. Now cut out the shit and let us in.
I'm the one who decides who gets through this door!
I don't believe this shit. We're arguing for our lives here with a damn mental moron.
I am not a mental moron! You think you're special? With your leather jackets and your fancy blood? Nobody writes for free. Ding dong!
Mister, if one of us gets killed out here, I'm gonna shoot my way in there and beat you to death with my gun!
Well, you'll have to be alive to do that.
Now, as far as the church guy turning into a special infected goes, I do not have a definite answer there. As I mentioned earlier, the special infected didn't start showing up until 2 weeks after the first infection, so I have no idea how this guy turned into a special infected so quickly. It's likely just there as a cool gameplay gimmick because this should not be possible considering how the infection works in the Left 4 Dead universe. After dealing with the church guy, the survivors officially arrive at Riverside. The wall graffiti is easy to break down, it's just this written 100 times. Once you leave the safe room, you'll sometimes get this dialogue between the survivors.
Poor bastards barricaded themselves inside the city. All it must have took was one infected.
Riverside's a bust. Let's just get to the water and steal a boat.
If you ignore the crazy guy and the zombies, nice town.
Shortly after leaving the safe room, you walk past the store, with a sign in the parking lot that says the following: closed until further notice due to sickness. Right past the buses, you find a military vehicle and a van belonging to a news station. According to the wiki, this is the same news station that Rochelle used to work for before the infection hit. Near the end of Chapter 4, the survivors jump onto a road, and this is where we learn about Zoe visiting Riverside prior to the outbreak.
I've been here before. I always liked this main street.
Depending on the difficulty, this is one of the hardest events in the game, especially in versus mode. This segment is an absolute clusterfuck. Also, there's a good chance that a tank or a witch spawned during this event, making it that much better. Now with all that out of the way, let's move on to the wall graffiti found in Chapter 5. We have sown the seeds of sin. This is our punishment. Are you the Pope? End this now. Bring out the nukes. We're gonna bomb these things off the face of the earth. They die just like everything else. The army left us to die. Where is Evac Echo? North. Follow the train tracks. It doesn't exist. You people are walking to your deaths. Stay in Riverside. The army is coming. Shortly after leaving the safe room, the survivors cut through a house. Just like with the church, this house has sandbags by the entrance and an antenna. Once you look inside the house, you find yet another map of what I can only assume is a forest. After walking a short distance, the survivors arrive at a boathouse. Before talking about John and Amanda Slater, there's one thing that needs to be pointed out. If you look across the water, you see what looks like a city on fire, and that's because it essentially is. For those who don't know, this is Newburgh, the city that Dead Air takes place. And I'll go into more detail on this in the Dead Air video, but for now we're going to move on. Before talking about the finale from a gameplay perspective, I want to talk a little bit more about the man on the radio. While walking up to the house, the survivors hear a man talking over the radio. This man's name is John Slater, and he is currently on a boat with his wife Amanda. John Slater is voiced by John Patrick Lowry, who also voiced the sniper from Team Fortress 2. Amanda Slater was also going to get her own lines of dialogue, but these ended up getting cut. Amanda was going to be voiced by Ellen McLean, who also voiced GLaDOS from Portal. Before interacting with the radio, sometimes John can be heard saying this:
"Attention, anyone with ammo and firearms. If you can hear me, please respond. Anyone with some firepower on this frequency, pick up."
It seems that John and Amanda aren't saving survivors out of the kindness of their hearts. They're specifically looking for survivors with guns and ammunition. Maybe they just wanted bodyguards for the trip up north, but for reasons that are still mostly unknown, the survivors were kicked off the boat. In the Sacrifice comic, while riding to Fort Millhaven, Francis starts recounting all their failed evacuation attempts. Lewis, I hate to be the one to break this to ya, but we've been heading to the safe zone 4 times now. Helicopter crashed, plane crashed, boat kicked us out and left us to die. This line from the comic tells us a few things about John and Amanda Slater. 1. They kicked the survivors off the boat and likely stole their weapons and gear, which explains why the survivors are limited to Tier 1 weapons at the start of the Dead Air campaign. And secondly, just like with Virgil, John and Amanda are likely carriers. This line from the comic implies that John and Amanda were fine when they kicked out the survivors, but that doesn't mean that John and Amanda ended up getting a happy ending. In Chapter 2 of The Sacrifice, the same boat belonging to John and Amanda, the St. Lydia, can be found partially sunk and abandoned. Now, let's finally talk about the finale from a gameplay perspective. Overall, I think it's pretty good. The house makes it easy to pick a corner and bunker down, but because you're fighting along a lake that will instantly kill you, all it takes is one charger or tank and you're as good as dead. Though I must admit, getting insta-kills here are very rare. After fighting off the infected hordes, John and Amanda show up and rescue the survivors, and that concludes the story behind Death Toll. This campaign has always been loved and respected by the community, but even then it feels a tad underrated. From both a gameplay and a lore perspective, Death Toll has a lot to offer. Up next we got Dead Air, which will hopefully be up by next week. If I did miss anything, be sure to let me know down below. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one. We've come down to 2 campaigns, and up next we have one of my personal favorite campaigns in the Left 4 Dead series. Dead Air is fantastic, and just like with Death Toll, I have almost no complaints. It's a fun challenge in single player, and in versus mode, the first 2 chapters are a Death Charger's paradise. All it takes is one mistake and you're as good as dead. You guys know the drill, so without wasting any more time, let's break down the story behind Dead Air. After the events of Death Toll, the survivors are seen holding out on top of a greenhouse. A plane can be seen flying overhead, and the survivors decide to give the nearby airport a shot, thinking that a working plane means working airport. If you go into NoClip and head to the left of the greenhouse, you see a massive body of water and a dock. In my last video, I talked about the Slaters kicking the survivors off the boat, and this dock is likely where they got dropped off. It is right next to the greenhouse after all. You can also find a boat here, but it looks nothing like the St. Lydia seen in Death Toll. After leaving the greenhouse, the survivors get a look at the city of Newburgh. The survivors have fought through ruined cities before, but Newburgh is a little different. I'll let the survivors explain.
The whole damn city's on fire!
Last time I was here, the city wasn't so much on fire.
Man, this is gonna take forever to rebuild.
Without sugarcoating it, Chapter 1 of Dead Air has very heavy implications of military bombings. We'll talk about it more near the end of the video, but for now we have some graffiti to break down. The first one is shortly after leaving the greenhouse. On a rooftop, written in paint, you can find some graffiti that says, "Help, need food." Now, before we break down the wall graffiti found in Chapter 2, there are a few things that I want to point out. 1. At the entrance to this building, you can look up and see the name Harbor View Hotel. Secondly, a room on the 8th floor has its lights on. This could be a survivor or nothing at all, but regardless, I think it's worth pointing out. Now, let's break down some more wall graffiti. They don't eat, they don't sleep. What keeps them going? I hope they get me in my sleep. I hope that's where they get me too. This is our punishment. It's just dead air.
Roll credits.
Where's the evacs? Near the front of the safe room, you can find another CETA evacuation notice which reads as follows. All frequency broadcast. A list of evacuation centers will be updated hourly on all radio frequencies. The words "nothing on radio" can be seen written on the bottom of the paper. Halfway through Chapter 2, the survivors come across a crane, and use it to get across the rooftops. In single player, this event is fine, but in versus mode, it's a whole different ballgame. Heavy caution is required when playing the early chapters of Dead Air in versus mode, because even an average team can take advantage of the countless insta-kill opportunities. Shortly after, the survivors cut through a law firm, and sometimes the survivors will have this back and forth.
What do you call 5,000 infected lawyers?
Hey, Suit, this look familiar?
Hey, Lewis, all these cubicles make you homesick?
Now with all that out of the way, let's break down the wall graffiti found in Chapter 3. Trevor, we're going to the airport anyway. No other choice. We're sorry. C and L. The planes are falling out of the sky. Nothing is coming but a bomb. Open your eyes. The virus was a military experiment. It was engineered in a lab. By aliens. What if this was first contact? What if you're an idiot? After leaving the safe room, the survivors come across a barricade and decide to burn it down using conveniently placed cans of gas. This event is honestly one of the easier ones in my opinion. It's easy to position yourself on either the nearby building or the scaffolding and just blast away at the zombies climbing up. It's a solid event, but I wish it had a better setup. Near the end of Chapter 3, the survivors officially arrive at Metro International Airport, and just like everything else in Newburgh, it's partially destroyed and infested with zombies. Regardless, the survivors head inside, hoping for the best. There is a lot to go over in Chapters 4 and 5. Let's start with some wall graffiti. We are the real monsters. You are a real moron. No, that's the zombies, idiot. I think it's them, stupid. I hope you're dead now, moron. Have you been outside, jackass? I miss the internet. On the right of the safe room, you can find a mushroom cloud with tally marks that add up to 35. After getting a look at the inside of the airport, the survivors will sometimes have this back and forth.
Just like I said, they bombed the airport.
They really trashed this airport.
What idiot bombed the airport?
Shortly after leaving the safe room, the survivors cut through a hallway, and on the wall you can find even more graffiti that says God is dead. And sometimes Zoe and Francis will chime in with this.
Oh no, the zombies killed God!
God's dead, huh? Well, join the damn club.
While walking through the airport, you may have noticed a few advertisements with some familiar names and locations. Let's break down a few of them. The first one is shortly before the van. You can see a sign displaying this: Riverside Children's Animated Film Festival. The event was going to start on October 23rd and end on October 25th. Important to note that these dates also line up with the dates found in the church. The next advertisement is a few steps to the right, where you can find another ad displaying the Allegheny National Forest. Try and remember the name because it will be important later. The next one is by the van, where you can find a pill advertisement with a very familiar phrase. After the van, you can find another ad for Mercy Hospital saying, "Give blood, save lives." And finally, near the end of Chapter 4, you can find a sign displaying a burger tank. Now let's move on. While walking through Chapter 4, you may have noticed this name, Vector Airlines. Here's a little fun fact. A vector, to put it in the simplest terms, are living organisms that transmit diseases between individuals. And remember, at the end of this campaign, a plane flies off with our crew of infected survivors. That would technically make the pilot a vector for the green flu virus. Near the end of Chapter 4, the survivors come across a metal detector and have to fight the infected to reach the safe room. Before we talk about Chapter 5, there are a few things that are worth pointing out. The first one is this statue. After walking past it, Zoe will sometimes chime in with this.
Hey, Ayn Rand International Airport.
I hate Ayn Rand.
This is a reference to Atlas Shrugged, a book written by Ayn Rand. Zoe, being a college student, likely read the book before the outbreak and came up with this joke on the fly. Another thing that should be noted is that if you are super unlucky and get a tank spawn down here, the tank can break the statue and instantly down survivors using the giant globe. And finally, when you walk up the stairs, the survivors get a good look at the runway, and sometimes you get this back and forth between the survivors.
Oh my god, Bill was right. They bombed the airport. They must have been trying to stop the infection from spreading.
What did I tell you? They tried to stop people from leaving.
Bill? I was the one who said that.
The event at the end of Chapter 4 is one of the hardest in the game, and I know I say that a lot in these videos, but for this one I especially mean it. Expert or versus mode, it doesn't matter. Odds are you are not making it to the safe room. Now, before we talk about the finale, let's break down some wall graffiti. The safe room in Chapter 5 only has one piece of graffiti, and it's this. A memorial for an M. Ashton. The date is faded and very difficult to read, but I'm pretty sure the date is October 3rd, 2009. After the survivors leave the safe room, they witness a plane crash right in front of them. A few things to take note of before we talk about the plane pilot. 1. Most of the destroyed airplanes in this finale are orange and white. The plane that crashes in the intro, however, is blue and white. Secondly, a very similar airplane can be found in Chapter 2 of Swamp Fever. Reused model? Maybe, but it's still worth pointing out. Thirdly, if you look at the tail end of the C-130 that flies out the survivors, you can see the letters ROKAF, or Republic of Korean Air Force. This raises a lot of questions. First of all, in about 30 seconds, I'm going to show you guys some voice lines for the plane pilot, and you'll notice that he talks in a Midwestern accent. So we have an American pilot flying a military plane from the Korean Air Force, and as we'll come to find out, this pilot flew out multiple survivors from Newburgh before the survivors arrived at the airport, but we'll get to that in due time. For now, let's go over a few of the pilot's voice lines.
Hey, you there! Gas me up, I'll get you out of here! Alright, gas me up, and we can fly out of here!
Before we talk about the finale from a gameplay perspective, there are a few more pilot voice lines I want to go over. These voice lines I'm about to show you were cut from the game, and I couldn't find an audio file, so I'm just going to read them off for you. First of all, big shout out to Jace for bringing this to my attention. Seriously, he's been a massive help throughout the series. Here are a few of the pilot's cut voice lines. Yeah, I'm a coward for not helping you. Guess I'll just sit up here in my cockpit, flying you out of this hellhole, like I've flown everyone else who came looking for help, but no, thank you for being honest. I've been risking my life flying people out of this airport all goddamn day. Then the government dropped a bomb on me, so excuse me if I don't skip down there and pick up a rifle. You calling me a coward? Get this straight. I can fly planes, you can run around getting killed in a post-apocalyptic world. That makes me valuable and y'all are worthless. It's not just the pilot either, the survivors also had a few cut voice lines that I'll show in just a second. Before we do that, however, we have a few things to break down. 1. The military was in fact dropping bombs in Newburgh, and it looks like they were targeting airports to prevent the spread of infection. 2. The pilot has already evacuated multiple survivors from this airport and dropped them off at an unknown location. And finally, if you check the wiki, it states that the survivors were supposed to have an argument with the pilot throughout the finale, but these ended up getting cut. It should also be noted that in these deleted voice lines, the name Terry is mentioned multiple times. More specifically, the survivors will comment on Terry being dead. Odds are the body holding the radio was meant to be Terry. Maybe he was a companion or friend to the pilot. Regardless, I think it's super interesting. Before we talk about the finale from a gameplay perspective, there is one last thing that needs to be pointed out. The plane pilot is voiced by Gary Schwartz, who also voices the Demo Man and the Heavy from Team Fortress 2. For those keeping score at home, this is the 4th Left 4 Dead NPC voiced by a TF2 character, and it's 5 if you count Ellen McLean. Now, let's talk about the finale. It's an alright finale in my opinion, but the wide open spaces make it difficult for spawns in versus mode. However, the tank has plenty of luggage carts that can instantly down survivors, so I guess it evens out. Overall, it's an okay finale. After fighting off the infected hordes, the plane gets fueled up and the survivors fly out of Newburgh. Now, before we conclude the video, there are 2 things that deserve a mention, and I'll go as quickly as I can. First of all, in the Sacrifice comic, while arguing with Lewis, Francis mentions that the plane ended up crashing. The reasons for the plane crashing are still mostly unknown, however. In typical Left 4 Dead fashion, the pilots would turn into zombies after coming into close proximity to the survivors, but if you look inside the plane, you'll notice that the cargo hold and the cockpit are completely separate. Unless the survivors went into the cockpit, the pilot couldn't have turned into a zombie. Keep in mind, it is entirely possible that the pilot ended up getting infected. Like almost everything in Left 4 Dead, it's not made very clear. It's entirely possible that the plane ended up getting shot down by the military. A lot of evidence throughout Dead Air points to the military trying to prevent the spread of infection. It also explains why this guy is helping survivors all by himself. He's doing it right under the noses of the military. It also explains why he was flying so low to the ground in the intro. He's trying to avoid radar detection. Like I said, either is entirely possible. What we do know is that the plane ended up crashing and the pilot is almost certainly dead. And finally, for those who may not know, there was supposed to be another campaign in Left 4 Dead 1, and it was going to act as the bridge between Dead Air and Blood Harvest. This campaign was going to be named Dammit. If you check the wiki, it even states that the original plan was for the plane to crash near this dam. I might do a video on this campaign in the future because it was supposed to be canon, but we're going to have to wait and see on that. And that finally concludes the story behind Dead Air. This is a great campaign, and definitely one of my favorites from the first game. Especially as a versus player, the first 2 chapters are an absolute blast. We've come down to 1 campaign, and it'll hopefully be up by next week. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one. After breaking down 11 campaigns over the course of a few months, we have reached the final campaign in the series. Blood Harvest is another one of Left 4 Dead's most underrated campaigns. The forest setting is a great switch up from the typical ruined city, and on the lore side, there is a lot to talk about. Blood Harvest does have some interesting dialogue and wall graffiti, but this campaign also has a lot of ties to the Sacrifice comic. We'll talk about it near the end of the video, but for now, let's break down the story behind Blood Harvest. After the events of Dead Air, the survivors are seen camping out in the middle of a forest. On the right, you can find a sign displaying the Allegheny National Forest, and below it you can find yet another CETA evacuation notice. This time, the location is Daughtery Farm. A few things to take note of before we get started. 1. If you look at the campfire, you can see the survivors using dollar bills to keep the fire going. Goes to show how worthless modern currency is in the zombie apocalypse. And secondly, while the exact locations of the campaigns are relatively unknown, we know that Blood Harvest takes place somewhere in the Allegheny National Forest. Not only that, if we're taking the cut campaign Dammit into consideration, Blood Harvest takes place somewhere close to the Kinzua Dam, which is the location of the Dammit campaign. And for those who may not know, the Kinzua Dam is a real dam in Pennsylvania. It's also located in the middle of the Allegheny National Forest. Keep in mind that Dammit was a cut campaign, so take this with a grain of salt. I'll go into more detail in a future video, but for now, let's keep talking about Blood Harvest. After crossing over a bridge, the survivors see a trailer, and sometimes the survivors will have this back and forth.
Francis, this look like home to you?
Yeah, I bet your country ass does like this trailer.
Shortly after, the survivors come across a building, and if you look down, you can see train tracks. If you go into NoClip and look on the side of the building, you can see the name Richardson Atlantic Freight Haulage. With that out of the way, let's break down the wall graffiti found in the beginning of Chapter 2. Head north to Echo. We deserve this. Maybe you did, I didn't do anything. Head north, get to Echo for evac to safe zone. Do not go. Army swarmed, farm is quarantined. Newburgh is doing helicopter evacs to safe zone. The army is dug up north. They're still taking immunes. It's the only evac for miles. Follow the train tracks. Chapter 2 is a very short chapter with one event involving an alarm door, and it's an easy event assuming you don't get the tank spawn. Chapter 3 has one piece of wall graffiti, and it's this, a whiteboard saying Echo. It should also be noted that just like with Crash Course, Blood Harvest has a lot of dead soldiers lying around, especially in Chapter 5, but we'll get to that in due time. For now, let's move on. At the end of Chapter 3, we have yet another event where the survivors have to break down a bridge by using a train. The safe room isn't that far, so it's an easy event, but in Versus, however, it's very easy to set up an ambush for devastating damage. We have a lot of ground to cover in Chapters 4 and 5. Let's start with some wall graffiti. In Chapter 4, there's only 2 pieces of wall graffiti, and it's this. Keep north, follow the train tracks to Echo. You can also find another SETA evacuation notice telling any survivors to head for the Metro International Airport. The words, "This is quarantine," is seen written on the bottom of the paper. The first thing of note in Chapter 4 are the piles of dead livestock. If you go back to the Swamp Fever campaign, Rochelle hints at the possibility of the green flu virus spreading through animals. And while we don't know the answer to this question, it's clear that the survivors were not taking any chances. These animals could have been killed by zombies or killed by humans out of fear of the infection spreading. And considering the bodies are piled on top of each other, the latter seems to be the most likely outcome. Near the end of Chapter 4, the survivors cut through a house. In the basement of this house, you find a massive pool of blood and a lawnmower. According to the wiki, this is a reference to the New Zealand film Braindead, which has a scene involving a lawnmower that is, well, quite graphic. It should also be noted that the popular Stephen King book Misery also features a very graphic scene involving a lawnmower, so it could be a reference to that instead. Regardless, it's one of the strangest things in this campaign. If you go to the first floor of the same house, you can find a departure schedule that looks like it belongs at an airport or a train station, and according to the wiki, this is the same departure schedule seen in the train station level in Half-Life 2. And finally, if you look on the side of the building, you can see the name Ramsey. I was able to find a Ramsey station, but it's all the way in New Jersey instead of Pennsylvania. Now with all that out of the way, let's move on to the wall graffiti found in Chapter 5. Farm is quarantined, go to Riverside. Boats are leaving and zombies can't swim. David, we think the farm is overrun. Everyone we meet keeps saying it's gone. We're heading north anyway, what else can we do? Fingers crossed, see you there. Barbara. Howard, push north. When you get there, head for Echo Farm. Army is evacing now. They can't hold out forever. Hurry. Shortly after leaving the safe room, the survivors find multiple signs placed by the military, and after a short walk through a cornfield, the survivors officially arrive at Daughtery Farm. A few things to take note of before we talk about the finale. You can find a sign near the front of the house that says the following: U.S. Military Evacuation Outpost Echo, Passage to Northeastern Safety Zone. In the Crash Course campaign, a map can be seen showing the locations of various safety zones, and on the top right, you can find a green circle labeled the Northeastern Safety Zone. In my Crash Course video, I thought this green circle was Fort Millhaven, but judging by this sign, the Northeastern Safety Zone was referring to Outpost Echo. I'll go into more detail on Fort Millhaven and Fort Echo in just a second, but we have a few more things to break down. When you walk inside the house, you find 2 dead soldiers and a radio. Behind the radio, you find a map, similar to the ones I pointed out in the Death Toll video. If you take a closer look, you can find various regions with an X over them and the words Overrun is written all over the map. This is where things get tricky. On the top of the map, you can find the words Echo circled in red, with 2 arrows pointing towards a safety zone north of the map. This raises a few questions. On this map, the farmhouse and Fort Millhaven are not labeled or seen anywhere. However, we can safely assume that the farmhouse is located somewhere on the upper part of this map, and we know this for a few reasons. Let's head over to the Sacrifice comic for more info. In the Sacrifice comic, we get a look at Fort Millhaven and the soldiers who are stationed there. The survivors then use a radio to contact the military, and then Lieutenant Mora then says the following: "Tell Echo Base we'll take the run." Based on this line from the comic, it's safe to assume that Echo Base is a reasonable distance from the farmhouse. Echo is clearly capable of pulling off this rescue mission if it was up for consideration, but Lieutenant Mora ends up taking the mission instead. It's also important to note that after calling for help over the radio, it takes about 10 to 15 minutes for the military to arrive at the farmhouse, once again implying that the farmhouse is not far from Echo Base or Fort Millhaven. Not only that, we can safely assume that Fort Millhaven and Fort Echo are very close to each other as well. While driving to Fort Millhaven, a soldier is seen talking to someone over the radio, and their conversation goes exactly like this. Rock, this is Rescue 9. We've recovered 4 Tango mics. Please advise. Rescue 9, bypass Echo and return to Millhaven. This line from the comic implies that the survivors actually drove past Echo Base on their way to Fort Millhaven. Now with that out of the way, let's go back to this map and try and pinpoint a location. Based on the evidence presented, I think the farmhouse takes place somewhere on the top right region of this map. Fort Millhaven, on the other hand, must be somewhere north of Echo Base. Remember, they had to drive past Echo Base to get to Millhaven. But keep in mind that most of this is just speculation. It's almost impossible to pinpoint an exact location. Now with that out of the way, let's go back to this map one more time. Similar to the maps found in Death Toll, if you look close enough, you can see regions labeled on the map, but they are very hard to read. I'm pretty sure this name on the top right says Candy Mountain, and this is Red Ridge River. Important to note that I couldn't find any of these locations in the Allegheny National Forest. There is a real-life tourist attraction called Big Rock Candy Mountain Resort, but it's in Utah instead of Pennsylvania. I was able to find a Red Ridge Lake in Pennsylvania, but it's nowhere near the Allegheny National Forest. Now, before we talk about this finale from a gameplay perspective, we have a few more things to break down. First of all, this farmhouse looks very similar to the farmhouse seen in the movie Signs. The movie also takes place in Pennsylvania. And secondly, when you walk inside the house, you'll sometimes get this back and forth between Bill and Francis.
You gotta be shitting me. We walked 100 miles, fight 5 million vampires?
They're zombies, Francis.
Whatever. And all they got is this goddamn tape loop? Screw the goddamn army.
And finally, we know that multiple groups of survivors were also looking for Echo Base, and we can safely assume that these survivors never made it to the farmhouse. In the Sacrifice comic, Lieutenant Mora is seen talking to one of his men, and he then says the following. We have not heard from command in 6 days. That is a fact. We have not heard from any survivors in 10. The military not hearing from any survivors in 10 days implies that the crew from Left 4 Dead 1 were the first and only group of survivors to make it to the farmhouse alive. Before we move on, here's a fun fact. The soldier over the radio is voiced by David Scully, who also voices Sergeant Johnson from the Halo series. He's also the voice of the Carrot from Pajama Sam, which blew my fucking mind, but anyway, let's talk about the finale from a gameplay perspective. This is a solid finale. You can either hold out in the farmhouse or the barn, and both are reliable strategies. Find a room, pick a corner, and start blasting, at least that's what I do. When compared to the other defend your position segments from the first game, this is definitely one of the better ones. After fighting off the infected hordes, the military shows up and rescues the survivors. Before we end the video, there is one more thing I want to point out. When the APC drives up to the farmhouse, you can see this written on the side. I tried looking for some obscure reference, but I couldn't find anything noteworthy. During the early stages of Left 4 Dead's development, however, the writing on the side of this APC was different. If you check the wiki, the writing on the side of this APC was instead TK-421. This is a reference to the classic movie Star Wars. TK-421 was the designation of a stormtrooper aboard the Death Star, and his armor was later used by Luke to conceal his identity. And with that, we can finally conclude the video. This campaign is very good. I personally think the chapters could have been a little longer, but even with that complaint, I still think Blood Harvest is a great campaign. Now that all the campaigns are officially completed, I wanted to say thanks to all of you. I never expected this series to pop off the way that it did, and having a platform to voice my thoughts and opinions on the game that I grew up playing is an actual dream come true, and I have you guys to thank for that. This series may be over, but that doesn't mean I'm done talking about Left 4 Dead. I have a few ideas for Left 4 Dead videos in the future that I'm sure you guys will enjoy. Moving forward, I hope you guys enjoy the content. Once again, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one. In my last video, I talked about how the Parish was my favorite campaign in Left 4 Dead from a narrative perspective. However, the Parish is not the only campaign in Left 4 Dead that has a very strong story, which brings us to the topic of today's video. The Sacrifice is another one of Left 4 Dead's best campaigns. It's only 3 chapters long, but I still think it's better than a lot of the other campaigns. And just like with the Parish, my favorite part about this campaign is the story behind it. However, unlike the Parish, which heavily relied on walls of text to tell its story, the Sacrifice is a lot more direct with its storytelling. Most people know about the ending and Bill's heroic sacrifice, but I'm willing to bet that most people don't know about the story that led up to it. The Sacrifice also has a comic book, which adds a whole new layer to this campaign and its narrative. In today's video, I'm going to be doing a story analysis of the Sacrifice campaign and its comic book. I will be doing my best to cover both, but keep in mind that the comic is where we get most of the details, so I'll mainly be covering that. But with that said, there is a lot of ground to cover, so let's not waste any more time. The comic starts off with the gang fighting off the infected hordes in the farmhouse at the end of Blood Harvest. After making light work of a tank, the military arrives and the survivors make a safe escape. After taking a second to breathe, Lewis starts talking cheerfully about how they're finally safe and get to kick back and relax in a safe zone. This is when Francis intrudes, and in typical Left 4 Dead fashion, Francis and Lewis start arguing. What the hell kind of attitude is that, man? Francis, we're in an armored personnel carrier, driven by the military, being taken to a safe zone. Can I finally get you to admit everything is gonna be just fine? Lewis, I hate to be the one to break this to you, but we've been heading to the safe zone 4 times now. Helicopter crashed. Plane crashed. Boat kicked us out and left us to die. Trust me, something will go wrong and we'll all be dead. Lewis tries to ask the driver of the vehicle where they're being taken to, and he's promptly ignored. Now, before we move forward, I should make something clear. The sacrifice goes into the backstories of each of the 4 survivors, but I'm going to be glossing over these for the sake of time. Besides, I might be saving these for a future video, but we'll see. Now, with that out of the way, let's continue. The survivors arrive at the safe zone, and the military orders them to drop their weapons and leave the vehicle. Francis starts running his mouth, which leads to one of the military officers smacking him with his rifle, knocking him out cold. The military officer then says, "Bring your smart-ass friend. Anybody makes a break for it, that body gets shot. Welcome to Millhaven." Later on, Francis wakes up in a cell with Lewis, who informs him that Bill and Zoe have been taken in for testing. Francis comes up with the genius plan of talking shit to the guards outside their door. Spoiler alert, this does not work. Later on, we see 2 commanding officers, Lieutenant Mora and Major Everly, having an argument about the security of Fort Millhaven. Lieutenant Mora argues that due to the mutation of the zombies, Fort Millhaven is no longer secure. Major Everly, however, scoffs at the idea of mutating zombies, writing it off as nothing but rumors. After the meeting, Lieutenant Mora voices his frustration to one of his soldiers. "Chain of command? We haven't heard from command in 9 days. This is a sick joke. We're on our own out here. Retreating from this base is not a defeat. Losing the men defending it is. What should we do, sir?" "Round up Penna, Brooks, and Davis. My quarters, 1400. I have one duty. To the men who put their lives in my care. I am not going to sacrifice my platoon. Not for Everly. Not for carriers." Meanwhile, Bill and Zoe are with the doctor mentioned earlier. The doctor requests to see an injury on Zoe's arm, but she refuses. One of the soldiers gets aggressive with Zoe, and Zoe responds by smacking him and taking his rifle. Another guard enters the room and diffuses the situation. After both soldiers leave, the doctor then explains that he too is a carrier, and he tells Zoe and Bill that the only reason he's alive is because the military thinks he can develop a cure. However, the doctor informs Bill and Zoe that a cure is impossible, and once the military finds that out, they're gonna kill all the carriers. Their conversation is interrupted by the alarm sounding. Bill and Zoe then lose their shit, informing the doctor that the infected are attracted to noise. Meanwhile, on the other side of Fort Millhaven, Lieutenant Mora puts a bullet in Major Everly, officially relieving him of his command. If you're curious about what carriers are, as well as more details on the military's treatment of the carriers, be sure to check out my previous video. But anyway, we then go back to Lewis and Francis in their cell. After a brief conversation, they hear the alarm sound. Lewis and Francis are quick to point out that the infected are attracted to noise, and they both request to be let out of their cell. A few seconds later, though, a witch is seen walking up the hallway. Lewis tells the guards to drop their weapons and get flat up against the wall. At first, the guards are hesitant, but they comply. The witch then walks right past the cell and the guards without any issues. After the witch is gone, the guard then unlocks the cell. "Alright, zombie experts, there's an armory down the hall. Let's get you guys some guns." At this point, Fort Millhaven is being completely overrun. Zoe and Bill are fighting the infected trying to get to the armory, where they find Lewis and Francis already waiting for them. The crew stocks up on ammo and resources and decide that a nearby train depot is their best bet at escaping. One of the guards, whose name is revealed to be Jeff, voices his concerns about the plan. A quarter mile of solid infected, and whatever these new things are, it'd be suicide. Jeff, was it? Jeff, the 4 of us walked here from Philadelphia. I think we can make it across a courtyard. We then cut to Lieutenant Mora and his crew fighting the infected outside of Fort Millhaven. A zombie attacks Lieutenant Mora, scratching his face and knocking off his mask. Mora commands to be pulled up, but his command is denied. The soldier brings up that Lieutenant Mora is now infected, but despite his fate being sealed, Mora keeps demanding to be lifted up. Eventually, he is abandoned by his squad and left to fight the infected by himself. We then cut to Bill giving his typical leader speech as the gang steps out of Fort Millhaven. "Alright, new meat, listen up. It's a quarter mile to the train yard. When we get there, we're getting on the first train pointing south. If you want to join us, that's your business. As for getting there, I don't care how much training you think you got. You stay close, you keep up, and you don't do shit until you see the 4 of us do it first. You fall behind, we leave you behind." As the crew is walking, Zoe and Bill have a conversation. "By the way, I call bullshit. No way you're leaving the new meat if they fall behind. Watch me." Zoe is visibly angry with this answer. "How about us? You leaving us behind too?" "Never. We come back for our own." The crew is interrupted by Lieutenant Mora, who's half dead and pointing a gun at Lewis. Bill responds by laying Lieutenant Mora flat on his ass with one punch. As the crew is running off, Mora attempts to shoot Lewis, but is killed by a tank before he could pull the trigger. The survivors are almost at the train, but this is when Annie and Jeff, the two guards who were with Lewis and Francis, decide to part ways with the survivors. Annie and Jeff then split off from the group. The survivors then make it to the train, and without wasting another second, Bill is able to get the train moving. As the train is leaving Fort Millhaven, however, multiple survivors, including the doctor, attempt to make it onto the train. Zoe screams at Bill to slow down, but her requests are ignored. All the survivors from Fort Millhaven, including the doctor, were slaughtered by the infected. After the train stops, Zoe and Bill have an argument, and this is easily one of my favorite moments from the Sacrifice comic. Bill, we know there's more carriers out there. People like us. We could find them. We could fight back. Zoe, we've been fighting back since we started out from Philly. We shot our way through hell to get to that safe zone. Almost died 10 times over. We got lucky. And they locked us up and tried to kill us. We tried it your way. The keys? Well, it's close enough to get to from here. It's miles off the mainland, full of inhabitable islands, good weather all year round, no more army, no more jail, no more zombies. I know it hurts, kid, but we can't save everybody. We gotta look out for our own or we will die. That is as simple as I can make it. Zoe then replies with, I'm not sad because we couldn't save everybody, Bill. I'm angry because I want my world back. I mean, half the time I think you're enjoying this. I hate this. I'm willing to die if it means we fight back. If it means we find more people like us, and we wipe these fucking things off the face of the earth, and you want to run off to an island and leave everybody. Who else have you left behind, Bill? Who else are you going to leave behind? This is a critical moment in Zoe and Bill's relationship. Bill's happy ending of going to a deserted island is almost the polar opposite of what Zoe wants, but they make their respective viewpoints crystal clear. It's one of those scenarios where you completely understand why both sides feel the way they do. Now, this is the moment where the Sacrifice comic merges into the campaign. Before we talk about the ending, I want to go over some of the dialogue in the Sacrifice, as well as some of the connections between the campaign and the comic. After starting Chapter 1, sometimes you'll get this dialogue between Zoe and Bill.
Good thing we left all those people behind so we could escape.
Pull yourself together. If not for me, then for them.
Whatever, I don't care.
A good chunk of the dialogue in the Sacrifice is Bill and Zoe arguing with each other, and while Zoe disagrees with the plan, she's ultimately outvoted and is forced to go along with it. Now here's an interesting point that I completely missed in all my years of playing this game. In the Sacrifice comic, the crew finds a working sailboat. Inside, they find a dead guy and a massive amount of supplies. Now they have everything they need. Food, water, a boat. One problem though, the nearby bridge is lowered and blocking the way to the ocean. Bill is quick to point out that whoever owned this boat left to raise the bridge and did not come back. Well, in Chapter 2 of the Sacrifice you find this written on the wall. Allison, Mark has a sailboat ready at the bridge. Meet us there. And in Chapter 3 you find this. Allison, bridge is down. We are screwed. I can't say this with 100% certainty, but I'm almost positive that this guy is Mark, and odds are Mark and his crew of survivors died trying to raise the bridge. Also, if you play the finale of the Sacrifice, you can find this exact boat if you look through the fence. Now that we got that out of the way, let's talk about the finale. After turning on all the generators, the crew presses the button and the bridge begins to raise. However, that's when one of the generators turns off. The bridge is now stuck and the survivors are low on ammo with a massive wave of infected coming their way. Lewis starts giving his, I guess it's over speech, but it's interrupted by Bill leaping off the bridge, demanding the survivors to cover him. You'll never stop coming, do you? Every time I think we're done, every time I think she's finally safe, I can finally rest, there you are again, like a bad nightmare, and I have had enough. Almost there. Do it, you old useless bastard. Get to work. Get them out of here. Get them safe. Don't let her down. Bill makes it to the generator and successfully turns it on. The bridge is successfully raised and out of the reach of the infected. After taking a second to breathe, Bill looks back at the bridge. Somebody must have moved that bridge since I looked last, because it looks about 1,000,000 miles away. No, don't think like that. You can still make it back. You can still... Suddenly, Bill is punched by a tank and knocked into a nearby room. Bill looks up and sees 3 tanks standing in front of him. Bill cocks his machine gun and lights up a cigarette, telling the tanks that he'll be with him in a minute. We then cut to the survivors on the bridge. Francis is about to jump down and save Bill, but he's stopped by Zoe, telling him that if he were to go down there, Bill's sacrifice would mean nothing. Zoe, in very Bill fashion, gives a speech to Lewis and Francis. We'll wait this out, keep an eye out for smokers, but otherwise we should be safe up here. We stay quiet, the horde will disperse. Then what? We get Lewis to the boat and we get the hell out of here. We look after our own. The final shot of the Sacrifice comic shows Lewis, Francis, and Zoe on the boat sailing towards a tropical island, which is exactly what Bill envisioned for them. That concludes the story of the sacrifice. However, before we end the video, there are a few more points I want to go over. Something I noticed when I read the Sacrifice comic for the first time was the contrast in leadership between Lieutenant Moira and Bill. These two men are very different, but what they both have in common is that they are seen as leaders in their respective groups. Lieutenant Moira talks a lot about protecting his squad and how he isn't going to stand by and watch people die. However, when Fort Millhaven is overrun and Moira gets scratched and infected, he commands his squad to lift him up. Moira is not a carrier, which means he's infected, and by joining the rest of his squad, he's putting their safety at risk. Lieutenant Moira knows this all too well, but that does not stop him from begging. Lieutenant Moira saw himself as a fearless leader who was doing what's right to protect his men, but the moment shit hits the fan and Millhaven gets overrun, Lieutenant Moira is exposed for the person that he is, a spineless coward who is only concerned about saving himself. Now let's compare that to Bill, who, instead of begging to be lifted up, willingly jumps down in an attempt to rescue his friends. And even when Bill knows he's gonna die, he doesn't beg and he doesn't cry. Here's one more panel from the comic book that sums it up best. Zoe, Lewis, Francis, you're safe. All I ever wanted was for you to be safe. I'd sacrifice another 100 people to keep you safe. I'd sacrifice myself. Course, that doesn't mean I'll go down easy. My job's done. Let's see what you got, you big dumb sons of bitches. Bill's sacrifice remains one of the best and saddest moments in Left 4 Dead's history. Valve's ability to tell a cohesive story with little to no cutscenes is very impressive. I hope I was able to add a new perspective to Bill's death and to the story of the sacrifice as a whole. If anybody's curious, I will leave a link to the Sacrifice comic in the description down below so you can read it for yourself. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Continuing the series where I break down the campaigns in Left 4 Dead 2, up next we got Dead Center, which is still my personal favorite campaign in Left 4 Dead 2. Usually when I break down a campaign, I have one thing to nail down and focus on, but Dead Center has a little bit of everything. Well, except wall graffiti. It only shows up one time in Chapter 4, and it also isn't deep or relevant to the story. But aside from that, there's lots of interesting dialogue bits and plenty of small details that can be easily overlooked, which is the exact purpose for this video. If I miss anything, be sure to let me know, but without wasting any more time, let's get started. Chapter 1 of Dead Center starts with the crew making it to the roof of the hotel just in time to watch the helicopter fly away. This is where we get a ton of different dialogue bits between the survivors. Keep in mind that Dead Center is the introduction campaign for Left 4 Dead 2, so this campaign had to establish its characters and their backstories, and Chapter 1 of Dead Center gives us all of that and more. Before we move on, I'm going to quickly go over some of my favorite dialogue bits from this intro, because just like the passing, a lot of the dialogue here is very funny. Just to list off a few.
God damn it, we just missed it.
Hey now, no need for cussing.
You're serious, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm serious.
Goddamn whirlybird left without us.
Okay, 1, stop calling it a whirlybird. It's a helicopter. 2, I don't like being in buildings that are on fire.
Looked like the whirlybird was heading to the mall across town. And I will call it what I like, Fancy Suit.
Helicopter! It is a helicopter! You call that thing a whirlybird one more time, I'll beat you so bad, your sister's gonna wish she never gave birth to you.
Now, if I'm being honest, the first 2 minutes of Dead Center are very confusing, simply because it's very hard to piece together what happened before the survivors arrived on the rooftop. For example, when you grab your gear and walk down the stairs and open the door, the survivors usually say something along these lines.
Holy shit, zombies. I saw the news reports. Hell, I produced some, but wow.
This is confusing because, what, did you guys not walk past these same zombies on the way to the roof? Did they magically spawn here after the helicopter left? What adds to the confusion is this important question. When and where did the Left 4 Dead 2 survivors meet each other? Because according to the dialogue in Chapter 1, they did not know each other for very long. Now what do I mean by this exactly? You want to know a small detail that took me a few years to catch on to? In Chapter 1 of Dead Center, when the survivors are referring to each other, they don't use each other's names.
Hey, football man. Is this a relative of yours?
Mr. Gambling Man, yeah, you in the suit.
Hey, in the suit. Stop shooting me.
And eventually you reach the elevator, where the survivors properly introduce each other and the voice lines you just heard are never used again. So with that in mind, let me ask again. When did the Left 4 Dead 2 survivors meet each other? Did they all meet up while climbing the stairs to the roof? That seems to be the most realistic outcome considering they don't even know each other's names, but again, I don't know for sure. If you guys have anything to add, be sure to let me know because I think it's a super interesting rabbit hole. Now, moving on. In Chapter 1 of Dead Center, immediately after leaving the safe room, if you enter a room on the right, you'll find a room with a map, pointing out the locations of military outposts. This is where the survivors learn that the military is still active in New Orleans, but if you look behind this exact table, you also find this. And if you're extra lucky, Nick will sometimes say this.
What's this thing in a cage?
So it's confirmed that Sita has captured at least one special infected. Now, to be fair, a boomer, when compared to the other special infected, would probably be the easiest to catch, but you can give Sita some credit there. Also, while we only have one picture, we can confirm that Sita likely captured multiple boomers, because of the boomer bile, which is a new throwable item added to Left 4 Dead 2, and it's exactly what it sounds like. Boomer puke in a little canister, courtesy of Sita. Now, moving on to the elevator where the survivors give their introductions. This is where we get a look at everyone's backstory and personality, and similar to the passing, you get a ton of different dialogue bits here. Just to list off my favorites.
Holy shit. This some sort of nightmare, goddamn zombie apocalypse and shit. Shit. The hell are we gonna do?
Hey, it's okay, man. We're gonna be fine. Tell me, what's your name?
Folks call me Ellis. I run an auto shop with a couple of my buddies. We're also in a band. I play bass.
How about you?
Nick. That's all you need to know.
Everyone just calls me Coach.
And I'm Rochelle. I haven't known you guys long, but, well, it looks like I'm gonna be trusting you with my life. So, hi, and thanks.
And what makes this even more interesting is that the dialogue will change if a survivor dies before they make it to the elevator.
Oh shit, man. I ain't never seen anybody die before.
Guys, what are we gonna do now?
Okay, oh god. This was a mistake.
Now, moving on to Chapter 2. You guys remember what I said earlier about Chapter 1 having unique dialogue because the survivors didn't know each other's names? Well, this also applies to the special infected. After seeing a special infected for the first time, the survivors, instead of saying their usual names, will instead say stuff like this.
It's that mean one that pounces on you.
Watch out for the big fat thing.
You hear that? Some of these things mutated.
And after killing a special infected, Nick will sometimes make a comment about its appearance, and this dialogue is different for each special infected.
So that's a charger, huh? I think he worked out that arm plenty. You should move on to back and legs. So that's a spitter, huh? Think she's single? So that's a boomer, huh? You know it's sad to see an eating disorder get out of control like that? So that's a tank, huh? Jesus, that thing is huge.
Keep in mind that almost all the dialogue you're listening to is unique to Dead Center, and I absolutely love how the main characters are, in a way, learning about the infected at the same time as the player. Before we move on, I want to quickly go over some voice lines from Chapter 1 and 2 that are incredibly rare. The first one is from Nick. After grabbing a pistol or a magnum, Nick will sometimes say this.
I used to steal these from cops back in high school.
Now, this next voice line is not incredibly rare because I don't even think it's in the game. As I was browsing the game files, I found a voice line for Rochelle that goes exactly like this.
What are you doing? Now the infected are going to swarm me!
I tried to get this voice line in-game, but as far as I can tell, friendly fire with a boomer bile is completely impossible. But judging by the existence of this voice line, boomer bile friendly fire was likely a feature at some point during the game's development. Also, before we move on, here's one more very funny dialogue bit from Nick. If Ellis gets grabbed by a jockey, sometimes he'll say this.
$10 says he takes him to the right.
Now anyways, moving on to Whitaker's gun store. Whitaker is an interesting character because we never see him and he doesn't make much of an impression. He could be a carrier or a normal survivor, it isn't made clear, but considering the defenses and the literal stash of weapons he's standing on top of, it's safe to assume that Whitaker is going to be completely fine. Now, moving on to the mall. The survivors don't see anything at first, but they hold out hope thinking the evac center must be deeper in the mall. And near the end of Chapter 3, you can find a sign that says Sita Evacuation Center. But in Chapter 4, it's revealed that the mall is completely abandoned. Now, at the start of Chapter 4, during the elevator ride down to the main lobby, the survivors quickly try and form a plan.
Sita's not going to save us. Any ideas?
Well, if you're looking for ideas, look no further, because I have a good one. So I just been thinking Jimmy gives stock cars around here somewhere. We just gotta find it, gas it up, and I'll drive that thing to New Orleans my damn self.
I'll agree to the idea, but I'm driving.
Oh, yeah, only if I get killed. Otherwise, you better kill me, because I am driving.
The finale of Dead Center is not exactly a fan favorite amongst the community, but in Versus, I must admit I love this finale. The multiple floors offer depth charge opportunities, and if you're the survivors, it's easy to get picked off and separated if someone goes for a can by themselves. After finding all the gas cans, the survivors pile into the car and drive straight through the mall entrance.
Next stop, New Orleans!
That concludes the story of Dead Center. This campaign was a lot of fun to break down. Dead Center serves as an introduction to Left 4 Dead 2 and its characters, and it's safe to say it knocked it out of the park. Not only is Dead Center fantastic from a level design and gameplay perspective, but once again, like a lot of the campaigns in Left 4 Dead, there's always small details that can be easily missed. But with that said, if I did miss anything, or if you want something to add, be sure to let me know down below. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Over the last 2 weeks, I've broken down the campaigns in the Sacrifice and the Parish, and those videos were a lot of fun to make, so I decided to make another. And up next we have the Passing, which, unlike the previous 2 campaigns I talked about, tells its story in a very unique way, at least when compared to the other campaigns. The Sacrifice relied on in-game dialogue, but also had a whole comic, which added a lot to its story. The Parish primarily relied on walls of text to tell its story. The Passing, on the other hand, tells its story through dialogue. Lots and lots of dialogue. I like The Passing, but my favorite part about this campaign, hands down, is the banter between the Left 4 Dead 1 survivors and the Left 4 Dead 2 survivors. It is so much fun watching these 2 groups interacting with each other. Thankfully, Valve thought the same, and was sure to give us as much dialogue between these 2 groups as possible. In this video, I'm going to be breaking down the story behind The Passing, going over the survivor interactions, the graffiti, and how the ending of the Sacrifice impacted the survivors from Left 4 Dead 1. We've got a lot to go through, so let's get started. After the ending of Dead Center, the survivors from Left 4 Dead 2 make a drive to New Orleans. However, after a few hours of traveling, they're stopped in the road by a familiar bridge. That's when either Zoe or Francis comes to greet the survivors. There is a ton of dialogue in this opening chapter, and a lot of it is really funny and sheds some light on the characters in both groups. Let's go over some of these interactions. If Zoe is the one to greet the survivors at the bridge, she explains in detail what Ellis has to do to lower the bridge.
And then once you get over here, we can fill up the generator. The generator will make a lot of noise, but don't worry, Ellis, we can cover you from up here. You got all that?
Ellis, are you going to answer her? He's got it! We'll see you on the other side.
Afterwards, Ellis is heard saying,
Man, oh man. I jumped Jimmy Gibbs' car through a plate glass window and I just met the prettiest girl I ever seen. Nick, shoot me now, brother. Things never gonna get better than this.
Ellis simping over Zoe throughout the Passing is very funny, but it's also very sweet, and shows just how soft-hearted of a person Ellis really is. Surely all the other survivor encounters will be this friendly.
I'm telling you for the last goddamn time, lower the goddamn bridge. You greasy vest-wearing monkey!
Is there any one of you 4 who isn't an asshole?
Okay, listen to me, jackass. Lower the goddamn bridge so we can drive our goddamn car across.
Bite me, Colonel Sanders.
And if that wasn't enough Nick for you, sometimes he'll have this encounter with Zoe.
That's terrific, Cupcake. Look, is there a man up there that maybe we can talk to?
Boo-hoo, I don't know what to do. Go to hell, Colonel Sanders. I could shoot you where you stand.
Would you lighten up? Man, nobody can take a joke anymore.
I thought this was incredibly interesting when I heard it for the first time. Zoe flat out threatening to shoot someone does not sound like something Zoe would do. But we have to keep in mind recent events in the story. I am of course talking about Bill's death. Zoe and Bill had a father-daughter relationship. And out of all the Left 4 Dead 1 survivors, Zoe was easily hit the hardest by Bill's death. And in this bit of dialogue that she has with Nick, you can notice Zoe's character having a shift in perspective. What do I mean by that exactly? In the Sacrifice comic, after Fort Millhaven is overrun, Zoe and Bill have an argument about what to do next. Bill wants to flee to a deserted island, making it clear that the 4 of them are the only things worth protecting. But Zoe wants to gather more carriers and fight the infected. Well, after the events of the Sacrifice, it's obvious that Zoe has abandoned that pipe dream, because there are more carriers standing right in front of her, and instead of teaming up, she flat out threatens to shoot one of them. I view this as Zoe embracing Bill's perspective, which was already hinted at the end of the Sacrifice comic, but it's pretty much confirmed here. Now, moving on to our next bit of dialogue, Francis and Rochelle will also have this flirtatious back and forth.
Okay, if you lower the bridge, I will give you a kiss.
Hell yeah!
It's nice to see that Francis still has his sense of humor, even after the events of the Sacrifice. And for those wondering, yes, he still believes that there are vampires, and it turns out Ellis agrees with him.
Are any of you vampires?
Oh man, I know, man. That's what I've been saying. If there are zombies, there has got to be vampires, wolfman, mummies, aliens, all that shit, man. It just makes sense.
Yeah, that's what I've been saying.
And as the group is walking away from the bridge, Rochelle and Nick will sometimes have this exchange.
See, Nick, you should try being nice sometime.
Or I could try being more attractive to greaseball bikers.
Now, I could spend another 20 minutes going over the dialogue in this 10-second intro alone, but there is a lot more to talk about in this campaign, so we're gonna move on. In Chapter 1 of The Passing, right before you reach the safe room, the survivors cut through a park that is staged for a wedding. And this is where we get some dialogue from Nick that tells us a bit about his backstory.
This is bringing back some bad memories. It's not easy to get blood out of a wedding dress. Don't ask me how I know that.
After this line, it's safe to assume that Nick, for the lack of a better phrase, didn't have the healthiest of relationships before the apocalypse. This isn't the first time Nick will make a joke about a witch sounding like his ex-wife, and considering Nick's personality, it's entirely possible that he's been married and divorced multiple times before the green flu outbreak. Now, moving on to Chapter 2. Shortly after leaving the safe room, the survivors walk past a tattoo shop, and sometimes you'll get this dialogue between Nick and Ellis.
Hey, Nick, you and me, we ought to get tattoos that say bros.
I'm gonna get a tattoo that says no. Ellis, did you get that girl's name? Because I can tattoo it on your ass. She'll like that.
Now, shortly after the tattoo shop, you enter a bar that has some graffiti on the wall. However, unlike the Sacrifice and the Parish, which has graffiti that often tells depressing and dark stories, the graffiti in the passing is a lot more upbeat and humorous. Just to name a few. Went to save my dog. If I'm not back in 15 minutes, everyone drop everything and come save me. Otis, out of film. No helicopter, zombies are too fast, not gonna make it. Frank West. Ed is the king of the zombies. Repent, the end is extremely fucking nigh. There's no call for language like that. I have to agree too much. End of the world or not, there are standards. Shotguns and M16s everywhere, and not a single roll of toilet paper? I take mine with me. Sita is bringing more. Now, moving on to the end of Chapter 2, the crew has to jump into a sewer to get under the river. Nick, being a germaphobe, did not enjoy this experience, to say the least.
Seriously, is nobody else freaked out right now? We are walking through a sewer.
That's really funny, but this next line from Nick is probably my favorite.
I am breathing shit air into my lungs. It is being absorbed into my bloodstream. I am literally full of shit.
Now we finally get to Chapter 3, and this is where we get yet another interaction between the two groups. I know I've said this like 4 times already, but there is a shit ton of dialogue here, and I don't want to make this video 30 minutes. So before we officially talk about the finale, I'm going to go over some of my favorite dialogue bits from this specific interaction. Sometimes when walking up the stairs, Nick and Francis will greet each other like this.
Hey, never thought a fancy ass like you would have made it this far.
That's funny, because I knew that your lazy ass would still be here.
At least I don't have a turd on my suit.
I put it there.
Man, I told you had a turd on your suit.
And sometimes Lewis will say this when referring to Nick.
You're right, Francis. He's not friendly. I think Bill would have shot him by now.
Rochelle and Francis will sometimes have this exchange.
Hello, Rochelle. A beautiful name for a beautiful lady.
Thanks. Nice vest.
Francis? Him? Are you kidding? Really?
There's also plenty of dialogue which has the survivors asking the crew from Left 4 Dead 1 if they want to join them on their trip to New Orleans, which is shut down pretty much every time. Before we move on, it should also be noted that after sharing their plan with the Left 4 Dead 1 survivors and asking them if they want to join them, Francis and Lewis both have lines that say this.
Nah, better not. Look, we've had enough with the military.
This is obviously referring to Fort Millhaven, where the Left 4 Dead 1 crew was taken at the end of Blood Harvest and almost killed. I find it somewhat odd that the crew from Left 4 Dead 1 didn't at least try to warn the Left 4 Dead 2 survivors of the military's view on carriers, but that's a nitpick more than anything. Now let's move on to the finale. It's the standard gas collecting, which most players are not very fond of, but this finale does have something the other finales don't. The Left 4 Dead 1 survivors will be supporting you throughout the finale, by shooting zombies and occasionally giving you supplies, and they'll even throw each other compliments.
Oh man, tell me Zoe don't look good with that gun.
Nice shot, Zoe.
Nice shot, Francis!
All right, Lewis, keep tearing them up.
Also, if Lewis kills a tank, sometimes he'll say this.
That is for Bill.
The dialogue in this campaign is fantastic, but this next bit might be my favorite. After finding Bill's body, sometimes Nick will have this interaction with Francis.
Hey, sorry for your loss.
There's not many of us left, brother.
It's nice to see Nick have an actual heart, and he also has this line once the generator is filled up.
Sorry if I was rude before. You guys are all right.
After filling up the generator, the crew makes a dash for the car, giving their goodbyes as they run across the bridge. As the car is driving off, the camera pans to the Left 4 Dead 1 survivors, and if you're lucky, you'll hear this exchange between Zoe and Lewis.
Should we have told them?
No. It's hard enough out there.
I honestly can't think of a good reason as to why the Left 4 Dead 1 survivors would withhold the information about the military to the Left 4 Dead 2 survivors, but again, this is a nitpick. Zoe also has this line that is incredibly rare.
Ellis! Ellis! Maybe we should have gone with him?
This not only hints at Zoe possibly catching the feels for Ellis, but this also hints that Zoe did not embrace Bill's worldview like I thought she did. Sure, she commits to going to the island in the end, but I do find it interesting that she at least entertained the idea of going with the survivors from Left 4 Dead 2. But sadly, this is a reality that never came to be. And yes, going with the survivors from Left 4 Dead 2 would essentially mean Bill died for nothing, that is true. But still, that is an alternate timeline that would be interesting as fuck to see. So that concludes the story of the passing. I'm sure there's some stuff that I missed, but I try to keep these videos short while being as informative as I can. If I went through every single bit of dialogue, this video would likely be 30 minutes, but that really goes to show just how much fucking dialogue is stuffed into this campaign. And I'm not framing it as a bad thing. I love it. Every time you go through this campaign, it feels like you're getting new dialogue almost every single time. Doing this video was a lot of fun, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. I recently did a community poll, asking you guys what campaign I should do a video on next, and Dark Carnival won in an absolute landslide. Honestly, I'm surprised it took me this long to get to this campaign. Sure, it may not be as dark or as tragic as the Parish or the Sacrifice, but the Carnival setting and dynamic level design is what makes this campaign so great. Valve took full advantage of the unique setting of this campaign by giving us plenty of small Easter eggs and, of course, hilarious interactions between the survivors. You guys know the drill at this point, so without wasting any more time, let's break down the story behind Dark Carnival. After the ending of the passing, the crew continues their trip to New Orleans, but during the drive they come across a massive traffic jam.
I hate to be the bearer of bad news, guys, but unless Ellis knows how to build a monster truck, we ain't driving through this.
Sorry, folks. This car is capable of miracles, but it can't drive over 20 miles of parked cars. I think we're walking.
After walking for a few seconds, the survivors see a sign displaying the Whispering Oaks amusement park, and usually Coach and Nick will have an exchange that goes like this.
Hey, Whispering Oaks! Shit, I used to go there when I was a kid!
Oh, good. Now we can die there as adults.
After walking a little further, the survivors take note at just how long the traffic jam goes on for, and sometimes you'll hear this dialogue exchange between the survivors.
Wow, look at all these cars. Poor dumb bastards, they thought they could escape on foot. Wait, that's what we're doing.
Well, maybe they left them when they got rescued.
That's one theory.
Coach is optimistic that the survivors stuck in the traffic jam were rescued. However, if you walk a little further up the road, you find a military jeep, and in front of the military jeep is a massive pile of bodies. These bodies could be infected or survivors. Once again, it's not made very clear. However, considering what the military was doing in New Orleans, mowing down a group of civilians isn't exactly a far-fetched conclusion. Perhaps this is a reach, but I do find it odd that this many bodies are placed this close to the one military vehicle closest to the highway. It's some food for thought, that's for sure. Speaking of horrible things done by the military, let's move on to the motel. Looks like a standard motel at first, until you check out the pool, where you find a pile of charred bodies and gas tanks scattered around nearby. These could be infected corpses, but keep in mind that these could also be carriers. Remember, in the Sacrifice comic, when the crew arrives at Fort Millhaven, we get a look at the military's exact method for dealing with infected corpses. The motel is also fenced off, so it's likely the military used this as a temporary outpost. And considering its close proximity to the highway, they likely took in some survivors. It's likely that a few of those survivors could be carriers, and the military had to deal with them the only way they knew how. Again, I don't know this for sure, they could be carriers or normal zombies, either is entirely possible. But remember, we've seen the military do this before. Now that we got all that out of the way, let's move on to Chapter 2. Before you even leave the safe room, the survivors will have an exchange talking about the Midnight Riders, a rock band that's supposed to be playing at the carnival. Ellis and Coach then bond over their shared love of the Midnight Riders.
Hey, the Midnight Riders! I used to love that band. Best pyrotechnics in the business.
Yeah, I saw him in 07, front row center. Lost my eyebrows.
About halfway through Chapter 2, the survivors eventually arrive at Kittyland, and Ellis could not be happier.
Holy shit, guys! Kittyland! Man, would you look at all these rides? And no lines! Wish we weren't in such a hurry.
Sometimes it feels like we're babysitting, doesn't it?
He's like a 5-year-old with guns and a comprehensive grasp of every swear word in the English language.
He is making the best of a bad situation. Ah, to hell with it. Woo! Kittyland!
Ellis can also be heard saying,
I want to ride one. Just let me ride the Screaming Oak once. Man, when are we ever going to be here again?
Ellis acting like a complete 5-year-old throughout this campaign is one of the best parts about Dark Carnival, and we're not even close to done when it comes to the funny and interesting dialogue bits. At the end of Chapter 2, the survivors come across a carousel, and sometimes you'll get this line from Nick.
A fenced-in carousel? Is this where they took child prisoners on day trips?
After turning off the carousel, the survivors arrive at the Tunnel of Love, which comes with a ton of hilarious dialogue interactions.
Bringing back any memories, Coach? You, a cheeseburger, romance in the air?
Nick, I was on the football team. Coach did just fine.
Give me a ballpark on Tunnel of Love makeouts, Nick. Under 20? Under 10? 5?
Psst. Huh. Several. Easily.
Also, while fighting through the Tunnel of Love, you'll sometimes hear these rare voice lines between Rochelle, Nick, and Ellis.
Katana sword of love here.
The air duct of love.
Incendiary ammo of love here.
It's small shit like this that I absolutely love. And shortly after leaving the Tunnel of Love, the survivors are then faced with the Screaming Oak roller coaster. Turns out Ellis gets his wish of going on an amusement park ride after all, because the safe room is on the other side of the coaster. What happens next depends on the game mode you're playing. If you're playing by yourself or with 4 players, this is one of the best segments in the game. If you're playing on Versus, however, good fucking luck making it to the safe room because this specific area is a nightmare for the survivors. Any decent infected team is going to absolutely feast here, and there's also a high chance at a tank spawn near the end of the coaster. Now with all that out of the way, let's move on to Chapter 4. I think this is a good time to mention a few Easter eggs that can be found throughout this campaign. Carnivals are full of games, of course, and in Left 4 Dead 2 you can actually play some of these games yourself, which include a shooting game in Chapter 2 which rewards you with the infamous gnome. Chapter 4 has 2 minigames that both reward you with achievements. The first one is shortly after leaving the safe room, right in front of the bumper cars. After equipping a melee weapon, pop an adrenaline shot and smack away. The bell will fly off, however, and alert a horde, so do keep that in mind. The second minigame can be seen shortly after. In this minigame, you have to smack Mustachio as he pops up. A melee weapon works, but you can also just shoot him to make it easier. After reaching a score of 42, the machine breaks and you're rewarded with the achievement. Once again, this summons a horde, so use with caution. Another thing that should be noted is the high score of 42, which is likely a reference to the numbers 4 and 2 seen in Left 4 Dead's title. Before we move on to the finale, here's a little fun fact. Apparently, Dark Carnival was supposed to have a barricade somewhere because Nick has a voice line that goes like this.
We're gonna have to destroy this rubble pile.
And upon checking the wiki, I found this. Turns out there was also a different plan for the finale involving a monorail. To quote the wiki, it was planned as a monorail. The survivors were to climb to a roof and jump atop the monorail from there. There was also a plan to have a barricade somewhere in the map, but the idea was scrapped. And if you guys recall the intro cinematic of Left 4 Dead 2, you can see Nick climbing atop the Screaming Oak while it's erupted in flames. This obviously doesn't happen in the Dark Carnival campaign, but maybe this was an idea during the early stages of Left 4 Dead 2's development. Now, with all that in mind, let's move on to the finale. Before we even leave the safe room, we have a ton of wall graffiti to break down here, and it sheds some light on what happened at the carnival during the early stages of the outbreak. Why are we still here? Not enough buses. Not enough sense. They're trying to save us, and they're not. CETA sucks. 10 plus rep. And if you check the other side of the safe room, we also have this. Midnight Riders, rest in peace. We are gonna miss you, Riders. Best band in the world. The Riders got me through some rough times. They will be missed. The Riders are okay. They got choppered out last night. Probably heading off to play at the mall opening. Coward bastards. Must be nice to have enough money to buy a helicopter. We wait around for weeks while they skip to the front of the line. Assholes. Now there is a lot of interesting shit to break down here. Let's start by quickly revisiting this line of text. We wait around for weeks while they skip to the front of the line. This is very oddly similar to another wall of text found in Chapter 2 of the Parish, which goes exactly like this. I've been here for a week and they're shipping out people that just got here. Those are carriers. Good riddance. The only good carrier is a dead carrier. Now, let's recap what we know for sure. There was a large group of survivors at the stadium waiting for evacuation. The Midnight Riders were present at the stadium, and according to this wall of text, all of them left in a helicopter, while other survivors who have been there for weeks were left behind. And finally, we've seen survivors getting split up and divided like this before. Considering the evidence, it's very likely that the Midnight Riders are in fact carriers. But if this is true, why weren't they executed? Why were they put in a helicopter while all the other survivors were left behind? If you watched my video on the Parish, I talked about the military executing large carrier groups in New Orleans, which is not only heavily implied, it's all but confirmed at this point. But if my theory is correct and the Midnight Riders are in fact carriers, then why weren't they executed like the carriers found in New Orleans? Maybe they were taken in for testing, maybe they were taken to the Caribbean to join the carrier ranks, or maybe I have this whole thing backwards and the survivors left behind in the stadium are in fact the carriers, and leaving them behind was perhaps a tactical decision by the military. Maybe Valve planned on the Midnight Riders being the playable characters of Left 4 Dead 3. Most of this is complete speculation, so I don't know. If you guys have anything to add, be sure to let me know because once again, this is a very interesting rabbit hole. But before we move on, there's one more thing that should be noted, and yes, my deepest apologies for not pointing this out in the Passing video. In Chapter 2 of the Passing, there's an Easter egg where you can briefly see the Midnight Riders tour bus driving by, meaning yes, it's very likely that the Midnight Riders are still alive. Now with all that said, let's move on to the finale. This time around, it's Coach who comes up with the brilliant idea.
Y'all know the Midnight Riders? They gonna save us. We start their finale, that chopper's gonna know something's up because nobody, and I mean nobody, has a bigger pyrotechnics show than the Midnight Riders.
Coach, You are a brilliant man.
Here are some things people may not know about the finale. If you walk up to the microphone on the stage, it actually works, and will amplify the characters' voices. Coach and Ellis will take this opportunity to sing random lyrics from a Midnight Rider song, but the player can also use this as an opportunity to annoy the ever-living shit out of your teammates by spamming a vocalizer into the microphone. The finale of Dark Carnival, at least in single player, is one of my favorite finales. A Midnight Rider song playing in the background while fighting the infected hordes is a very badass and entertaining finale. It sucks in verses due to the vast empty spaces which lead to minimal spawn opportunities, but still, this finale is an absolute blast. After a few minutes of fighting off the infected hordes, the helicopter arrives and rescues our crew from the carnival, until he inevitably crashes into a swamp, but that's a topic for a different day. That concludes the story behind Dark Carnival. I want to thank everyone who voted on the recent poll, and I wanted to thank all of you in general. The Left 4 Dead videos have been doing amazing on my channel, the comments, the support, it means more than you know, and I'll be forever grateful. But enough with the peachy bullshit. I will be doing another community poll where you guys are going to vote on the next campaign for me to break down, but until then you guys know the drill. If I missed anything, be sure to let me know down below. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. I'm going to be 100% honest. When I put up the recent community poll, I was expecting No Mercy to pull away. But to my surprise, Swamp Fever took home 48% of the votes. So ask and you shall receive. Swamp Fever is not exactly a community favorite, but over the years it's been steadily gaining more popularity, which is deserved, because Swamp Fever is one of this game's most underrated campaigns. Most Left 4 Dead campaigns involve fighting through entire cities to get to your destination. And while there's nothing wrong with this concept, it's nice to take a break from it every once in a while. This is the exact reason why I think Dark Carnival is so universally loved by the community. Swamp Fever is a very fun campaign for similar reasons. The damp and isolated swamp comboed with the grim atmosphere is what I love the most about this campaign. But enough with the introductions. Let's break down the story behind Swamp Fever. After the ending of Dark Carnival, the helicopter crashes and the survivors are stranded in an unknown location. At the start of the campaign, the survivors will usually have a back and forth that goes like this.
Nick, what the hell? You shot the pilot!
Well, he wasn't doing a very good job once he became a zombie, now was he?
That's true. If I had to pick a low point in the flight, it was probably when he stopped flying the chopper and attacked us.
I can't believe none of you were going to shoot him.
Sometimes Coach will have this exchange with Nick.
Man, that was some shit. The pilot becoming a zombie right before our eyes? Nice shooting, Nick.
No problem, big guy. Sorry about the landing.
I had worse landings. Actually, that's a lie to spare your feelings. That crash was pretty bad.
Nick showing genuine care and concern only becomes more frequent the further you get in the Left 4 Dead story. It's nice to see him warm up to the survivors over time. After walking a short distance, the survivors see a gas station with a sign displaying this: "No CETA, no military. Stay out." The survivors take note, but regardless they keep moving, assuming that the people who did live here are either dead or infected. After walking a little bit further, the survivors come across a small village filled with small cabins and shops. One of these buildings has the name Earl's Gator Park, and sometimes you'll get this dialogue between the survivors.
Based on the location of Whispering Oaks, our previous airspeed, and accounting for the wind speed, I would place us right at Earl's Gator Village.
Rochelle, I see the sign.
The survivors then arrive at the river and need to call a ferry to get over. But before we talk about the ferry ride, there are two things that need to be pointed out. The first one is this sign next to the ferry controls that says, "Gone to Village des Marais." This is an important piece of information that I will talk about in more detail later in the video. But for now, we need to talk about this. A charger, dead and hanged, almost like a scarecrow. This is so incredibly interesting and tells us a lot about the swamp and the people who resided here. First of all, I think we can all agree that the Charger is one of the strongest special infected in the Left 4 Dead universe. We saw in Dead Center that CETA was able to capture a boomer, but we have no evidence of them catching any other special infected. The swamp people not only have the firepower to take out a Charger, but they also went as far as to hang it up by the entrance, almost as a warning to any trespassers. To put it in the simplest terms, the hanging Charger comboed with the sign at the gas station does not paint a good picture for the swamp people. It's obvious by the rundown cabins and damp environments that these people likely lived a very unconventional lifestyle even before the apocalypse, and judging by the sign and the dead Charger, it's obvious that the people who lived here were not exactly friendly to any outsiders, which is basically confirmed later on, but we'll get to that in due time. For now, let's talk about the ferry ride, which of course comes with hilarious dialogue.
Alright, Coach. Got anything inspirational to say as we enter the swamps?
Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil.
Yeah! I'm walking through that valley and I'm kicking some ass.
This dialogue also has different variants. Sometimes Coach will respond with this instead.
Alright, Coach. Got anything inspirational to say as we enter the swamps?
Hey, maybe we ought to just stop this boat right here and live the rest of our years between the shores.
Wow, Coach, that was uplifting.
Nick, we going to a swamp filled with zombies. Y'all want me to lie to you?
Man, I wish we were back at that amusement park. Nick, remember we ran on that roller coaster?
Yes, I remember, Ellis.
Oh, come on now, that was fun.
Nick and Rochelle will also have this back and forth.
Hey, Nick, what do you think the odds are that the swamp people are still alive?
What, alive infected or alive and not zombies?
Not zombies.
100 to 1.
Sound about right. So what do you think is going to kill us? Zombies, gators, snakes, bugs, or swamp people?
You forgot one thing. From the way we shoot, each other.
The rest of Chapter 1 is the survivors fighting through the outer swamp and reaching the safe room in a drainage pipe. Chapter 2 is where we get a lot more story implications. Shortly after leaving the safe room, the survivors find a parachutist. If you get a closer look, you'll notice he's wearing a military uniform, and you can pick up a random Tier 2 weapon, a healing item, and one throwable item from his corpse. Sometimes Ellis will even chime in with this.
Why would he parachute out here?
And for once, Ellis makes an incredibly valid point. Why parachute a soldier all the way out in the middle of nowhere? It's a really good question that we don't have a lot of answers to. Another thing that should be noted is that this guy did not parachute down here alone. Next to the dead parachutist, you can find another dead guy in the water, wearing a military outfit and a parachute on his back. And shortly after finding the parachutist, the survivors come across a downed airplane. And sometimes Ellis will even chime in with this.
Holy shit. Well, this explains our parachutist.
Despite this line from Ellis, I personally think that this parachutist did not jump from this airplane. And sure, on its face that sounds stupid, but hear me out for a second. This looks like a completely normal commercial airplane that was likely flying civilians. If it was a military plane, I would be more open to it, but two heavily armored soldiers on a completely normal looking airplane just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. We can assume that the plane crashed during the early stages of the green flu outbreak. Odds are multiple passengers turned into zombies mid-flight and brought the plane down in the swamp. Also, this may be a reach, but regardless, I think it's pretty cool. This crashed airplane looks very similar to the crashed airplane seen in the finale of Dead Air. This means one of two things. Either A, this airplane came directly from this airport, or B, Valve just reused the plane model. And yeah, option B is the likely answer, but hey, it's always fun to speculate. Now, moving on to the end of Chapter 2, the survivors see a path leading to a village. They also see working lights, and the survivors are excited upon seeing this, thinking that the swamp people may have actually survived. While walking up to the safe room, the survivors will even call out in hopes of getting a response.
Swamp people, we coming home!
However, at the start of Chapter 3, when the crew officially arrives at Village en Marais, it's revealed that the village is overrun with zombies. And yes, I know that this sign says Village des Marais, but the wiki refers to the village as en Marais, so I'm just going to be calling it that from now on. Got it? Okay, moving on. After finding out the fate of the swamp people, the survivors usually have an exchange that goes like this.
Oh shit, they didn't make it.
That's a shit ton of bodies.
Looks like they lasted here. For a bit.
This safe room also has some graffiti for us. Let's start with this one. Don't let outsiders in. We only got food and water for us. Napoleon Babin ran off like a coward. Jules, got tired of watching everybody die. Gone to find boat at Plantation House. You're smart, you'll do the same. On the other side of the safe room, we also have this. They're in the water. Anyone still alive, get to the Plantation House. And finally, we have this, a list of names. We can presume that these were likely residents of Village en Marais that died in a recent zombie attack. At the bottom, we have this name, Virgil Dugas, and yes, we'll get into more detail on this later. But there is a lot more to talk about still. First things first, let's talk about Village en Marais. Allow me to give you guys an incredibly brief history lesson. A Cajun, just to use the Google definition, is a member of any of the largely self-contained communities in the Bayou areas of southern Louisiana, formed by descendants of French Canadians, speaking an archaic form of French. The setting of Swamp Fever is not just a swamp, it's a self-contained community of French Canadian descendants. And judging by the wall graffiti and dialogue in Chapter 4, Village en Marais, despite their very unconventional lifestyle, were able to hold out longer than just about everybody. The Cajuns held off the infected to the best of their ability, but over time, Village en Marais was eventually overrun. Many of the residents lost their lives, but we can confirm that a few survivors were able to escape to the Plantation House. I promise we will go into more detail about the survivors from Village en Marais, but we have a few things to talk about in Chapter 3. Shortly after leaving the safe room, the survivors find this. And if you're extra lucky, Rochelle will also say this.
We heard reports that the virus spread through mammals, but I have no idea if that was true.
We don't have a lot of evidence of the infection being able to spread through mammals. However, it should be noted that you can also find dead cows in Blood Harvest. While walking through Chapters 2 or 3, Rochelle and Ellis will sometimes have this exchange.
Hey Ellis, does this remind you of home?
Yeah, very funny.
Nick and Rochelle will also have this back and forth if you're lucky.
Shit! This swamp is gonna ruin my white suit.
The white suit with zombie brains all over it? That one?
Brains come out. Swamp water doesn't. Don't ask me how I know that.
Now, let's move on to the plantation house, which has a ton of wall graffiti for us to break down. But before we do that, we're going to talk about a very special someone. In the finale of Swamp Fever, the survivors finally meet Virgil. Despite not even having a character model, Virgil has been a community favorite for years now. He also has a ton of interesting dialogue. Let's start with this line.
Well, hello there. I ain't heard another voice out here in 3 days.
This, along with the graffiti, confirms that the survivors from Village on Marais successfully made it to the plantation house. Not only that, most if not all of them left on a boat to New Orleans. More on that in just a second. But for now, let's keep talking about Virgil. Let's break down these two voice lines from Virgil that give us a lot of story implications.
It's been real quiet now since my woman got bit. Well, bonjour. It was real good to hear from somebody. It's real quiet out here.
Based on these voice lines, I am 100% certain on two things. 1. Virgil is a Cajun, and one of the last survivors of Village on Marais. Not only is he familiar with speaking French, we also see Virgil's name on the memorial wall in Chapter 3. Sure, I guess it's possible that there could be two Virgils, but again, it's also possible that Virgil survived the attack on the village and was simply presumed dead by his friends and family. And secondly, Virgil is very likely a carrier. A common trend in Left 4 Dead games is the pilot of the escape vehicle turning into a zombie. At first it was just seen as a running gag, but in the Sacrifice comic, it's confirmed that the pilots were killed because of their close proximity to the survivors. Quick lesson for those who may not know, carriers can spread the infection by simply standing next to someone. This is exactly what happened to the pilot at the end of Dark Carnival, and it's why he turned into a zombie. This does not happen to Virgil at all. Not only is he seen alive and well at the beginning of Hard Rain, but he also sails off into the sunset at the beginning of the Parish. Most pilots don't last one campaign in the series. Virgil lasted 3 with the Left 4 Dead 2 survivors. Meaning yes, Virgil is very likely a carrier. Now, with all that in mind, let's finally talk about the wall graffiti. First, let's start with this one. Clovis, Kevin, and Leon, all with tally marks, indicating the numbers of infected they killed. Leon has 2, Clovis has 17, and Kevin has 80. Below the tally marks you find this. Go to bed, Kev, what a load of BS. You get a good view of all my killings from your hiding place, Leon? This not only shows that the Cajuns had firepower, they also had enough ammunition to turn zombie killing into a competition, similar to what Francis did in the Sacrifice comic. We also have this wall of text. Just to read off the interesting bits. Alva Booton, if you're reading this, meet me in New Orleans. Waited as long as I could, child. Lou B. We'll be back, Village on Marais. Jenny and Remy. Village on Marais. We lasted longer than Shreveport. Longer than Bossier City. We held out longer than anybody. This officially confirms that not only are there multiple survivors from Village on Marais, most if not all of them left on a boat and headed to New Orleans. And judging by the dialogue shown previously from Virgil, these survivors departed from the plantation house only 3 days before the survivors arrived at the swamp. After fighting off the infected hordes, Virgil arrives and rescues the survivors from the plantation house. And that concludes the story behind Swamp Fever. Once again, thank you to everyone who voted on the recent poll. Swamp Fever, despite looking very boring on the surface, has a surprisingly great story. Going over dialogue and wall graffiti is just the standard in these videos, but learning more and more about Village on Marais and the survivors who resided there was a ton of fun. And there's still some stuff in this campaign that I can't explain with 100% certainty, like the dead parachutist. But with that said, if I did miss anything, or if you have something to add, be sure to let me know down below. Once again, thanks for watching, guys. So, we've reached the final campaign in Left 4 Dead 2 finally. Hard Rain is another weird middle ground campaign. People either love it or hate it. For me, it's somewhere in the middle. The backtracking and Thunderstorm is a cool gimmick at first, but the limited movement and visibility can get annoying at times. Hard Rain does come with some annoyances, but overall I think it's a solid campaign. Moving past the introductions, we have a ton of wall graffiti and a ton of dialogue to break down, so without wasting any more time, let's get started. After the events of Swamp Fever, Virgil drops off the survivors in a town, telling them to grab cans of gas so they can continue their trip to New Orleans. After Virgil departs, the survivors have a discussion on how they're going to signal Virgil once they retrieve the gas.
What are we supposed to signal him with?
Oh, there's flares in the gun bag.
What gun bag? Oh, fuck. Tell me we didn't forget the guns.
You didn't grab the gun bag?
Me? Who died and made me gun monitor?
Pretty much everybody.
Great. We are screwed. You want to hear a prediction?
No.
No.
There's not going to be any gas. Watch.
After walking across the street, the survivors arrive at a gas station, and as Nick predicted, there's no gas. Near the road, you can find a sign, presumably placed by CETA, saying, Ducatel Diesel, 2 miles. And sometimes Nick and Coach will have this back and forth.
No gas. See what I say?
All right, quit whining. We just gotta hike to this Ducatel diesel.
This is a good time to do a quick deep dive into the small town that Hard Rain takes place in. While the exact location of the campaigns are relatively unknown, it's safe to assume that Hard Rain takes place somewhere along the Mississippi River. Not only is it consistent with the location of Swamp Fever, if you take the Mississippi River all the way south, it'll take you right to New Orleans, which is of course the location of the parish and the end goal for the Left 4 Dead 2 survivors. While walking through this town, you'll also notice a name that appears throughout this entire campaign, Ducatel. And upon checking the wiki, it states that Hard Rain takes place in the fictional city of Ducatel, Mississippi. At the start of Chapter 2, you can look up and see a sign that says Ducatel Sugar Mill. When I checked the wiki again, it states that the sugar mill was supposed to be demolished, but by the time the construction crew arrived, the infection was already sweeping through the nation. It should also be noted that the construction worker zombies are the uncommon infected in the Hard Rain campaign. What separates these guys from the other infected is their soundproof headphones, making them immune to pipe bombs. Yeah, nowhere near as cool as the cop zombie or the scavenger, but hey, it's still kinda neat. And at the end of Chapter 2, you find another gas station. This time, it's named Ducatel Diesel. There is a lot of history to this small town that I will do my best to break down, but we have a few things to go over before we move on to Chapter 2. While walking through Chapter 1, you can find piles of orange papers. Trying to read these in-game is almost impossible. It's literally just pixels. But thankfully, these exact same posters can be seen on the right side of the Hard Rain poster. This piece of paper reads exactly as follows. This area is not safe. Evacuation in this area has been suspended indefinitely. You are advised to travel to New Orleans immediately. Do not attempt to communicate with infected individuals. At the bottom of the paper, you can see the CETA logo clear as day. Based on this, we can assume that CETA, during the early stages of the Based on this, we can assume that CETA, during the early stages of the green flu outbreak, at least tried to offer aid to the small town of Ducatel. But due to the rapid spread and overwhelming infected numbers, the town of Ducatel was left to fend for themselves. There is some wall graffiti later on telling us how the survivors tried to hold out in the sugar mill, but considering the sugar mill is the prime location for the witches, it's safe to assume that these survivors were killed, along with most of the other survivors in Ducatel. However, just like with Swamp Fever, we can confirm that some survivors headed to New Orleans, but we'll get to that in due time. For now, let's talk about Chapter 2, where we have some wall graffiti. City's gone to hell. Let's use the sugar mill as a holdout. The place is crawling with witches. Diane took Abel and went to the sugar mill. Ray, Jason, CETA's not coming. We're heading to the gas station and driving out tomorrow. Meet us in New Orleans. After taking a few steps outside the safe room, the survivors find themselves at the entrance of the sugar mill. Hanging on the wall, you can find a sign that says, "Stay away, witches." This is a good time to talk about one of the standout features of this campaign. Chapter 2 of Hard Rain is filled to the brim with witches. Sometimes you'll see two witches only a few feet away from each other. The survivors will often chime in with lines like this.
The last time I saw this many crying women was at my wedding.
How many goddamn witches are there?
Maybe the rain's bringing them out.
Witches must really love sugar.
Now with all that in mind, let's start asking the difficult questions. Why are there so many witches at the sugar mill? After doing some digging, the running theory is that the witches are attracted to sugar, which is implied in both the in-game dialogue and the wiki. But there's another fan theory that deserves a mention. Shout out Gatorheads for a very interesting theory on the witches and what exactly attracts them to the sugar mill. The theory states that the damage to the sugar mill wasn't the demolition crew or the storm, but instead a sugar dust explosion that led to the mill getting shut down. The theory states that the explosion likely killed many workers, and the women who were married to these men likely turned into witches and were attracted to the sugar mill, not because of the sugar, but because it's the primary source of their grief. There is also a lot of evidence backing this theory. The characteristics and behavior of the special infected are very hard to pin down accurately, since it's mainly speculation. But since Left 4 Dead 1, witches have shown more humanity than any other infected. They don't go out killing maliciously, only doing it when disturbed or directly provoked. Also, remember the witch from The Passing, dressed like a bride, crying in the dead center of a park staged for a wedding. A very odd location for a witch spawn, unless she was drawn to this location because it's the primary source of her sadness. Point is, this theory has a lot of evidence backing it, and frankly, I like this way better than the alternative. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to read the theory for yourselves. It's surprisingly in-depth, and he obviously breaks it down way better than me. But with all that in mind, let's move on to the end of Chapter 2. The crew arrives at Ducatel Diesel, and inside they find 4 cans of gas. Now all they have to do is head all the way back to Virgil's boat. But before we do that, we have some graffiti to break down. Like a metric shit ton of wall graffiti. Not gonna read all of them, but I will try to list off the interesting ones. Take what you need, leave some for the rest of us. This gas is for everybody. So is the infection. I take what I want. Jackson, took your sisters to New Orleans. Meet us at Kate's house. Be careful. Dad. Lily, headed south. I'll see you in New Orleans. Love, Noel. Sarah, kids are safe. Headed to New Orleans. I love you. Charlie. Mike was here, going to New Orleans. Based on all this wall graffiti, it's safe to assume that most of the survivors from Ducatel left to New Orleans, and the ones who didn't either died or tried to hold out to the best of their ability. Hard Rain is a very difficult campaign, and this can be attributed to many things. The limited movement and visibility is certainly a factor, but there's another thing that you need to watch out for. Because chapters 3, 4, and 5 take place in a partially flooded city, Molotov cocktails against tanks are completely ineffective. In 4 players, you can work around it, but in versus mode, a tank spawn usually results in a win for the infected team. Not that it really matters, because versus is basically unplayable nowadays, but hey, you get the point. With that in mind, let's finally talk about the finale. Upon seeing the burger tank, Coach will often chime in with a line like this.
I have never been so happy to see a burger tank, and believe me, I have been happy to see some burger tanks.
The survivors decide to use a burger tank sign to signal Virgil. This finale is okay. It's another defend your position segment that doesn't push any boundaries or do anything special. Overall, it's a pretty boring finale, if I'm being honest. After a couple of minutes, Virgil arrives and the survivors officially punch their ticket to New Orleans, and that concludes the story behind Hard Rain. The Left 4 Dead 2 campaigns have been officially completed, and now we can focus on the campaigns from Left 4 Dead 1. Thank you to everybody who voted on the recent poll, and I promise, the story behind No Mercy will be completed as soon as humanly possible. We only have 5 campaigns to go, and we're going to go in chronological order from this video onwards. If I missed anything, be sure to let me know. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Some people may not know this, but Left 4 Dead has an actual story. What separates Left 4 Dead from every other game is the way it tells its story. Aside from the intro cinematics, neither Left 4 Dead 1 or 2 have any cutscenes, so the narrative is heavily reliant on in-game dialogue and environmental storytelling. This worked in Left 4 Dead 1 to great effect, so naturally Left 4 Dead 2 was to follow in the exact same steps. The story of Left 4 Dead 2 is divided into 6 campaigns, each with their own unique themes, enemies, environments, etc. Now, I already ranked every campaign from worst to best, but if you ask me what my favorite campaign was from a story perspective, I would say The Parish without any hesitation. Since the game's launch, The Parish has been a community favorite, and is a blast in both 4-player and versus mode. Battling the infected through the ruined streets of New Orleans is a lot of fun, but if you ask me, the best part about this campaign is the very dark implication it has on Left 4 Dead's story. To make a long story short, The Parish does not paint a happy ending for our ragtag group of survivors. Let's go into more detail, and in order to do that, we need to go back to the start. In Chapter 1 of Dead Center, the survivors find a map showing the locations of military outposts. Almost all of them have been abandoned or overrun, except for one located in New Orleans. From this moment on, the crew decides that getting to New Orleans is their best chance at survival. Now, let's fast forward to Chapter 1 of The Parish. After finally making it to New Orleans, the crew is optimistic. There are plenty of military vehicles, and jets can be heard flying overhead. Early on in the campaign, however, explosions can be heard, and this is the first sign that not everything is as it seems. If the military has an outpost in New Orleans specifically to evacuate and save survivors, then why are they dropping bombs? You could argue it's to kill the infected, but it seems futile considering it's a global-scale zombie apocalypse. The survivors take note, but regardless they keep moving. This takes us to Chapter 2, and this is where we learn some very useful information. Left 4 Dead has always dropped lore or Easter eggs by using writing on the safe room walls, and in Chapter 2, the writing on the safe room wall tells us some very crucial information. One of the conversations goes exactly like this. I've been here for a week and they're shipping out people that just got here. Those are carriers. Good riddance. The only good carrier is a dead carrier. Now, you may be wondering, what is a carrier? Well, if you go to the other side of the safe room, you'll find another wall of text that answers that exact question. Why are they separating everyone? Some people are carriers. They're immune, but they can spread the infection. Who told you that? That's BS. This is explained best in the Sacrifice comic, which shows us what happened to the Left 4 Dead 1 survivors after being picked up by the military at the end of Blood Harvest. Zoe and Bill are in a room with a doctor who explains that carriers are people who are immune to the infection, but can spread it to other people. This created a massive problem for the military during the early stages of the outbreak. Carriers look and act completely normal, but the presence of even a single carrier puts every other healthy survivor at risk. Some military personnel recommended execution, while others were determined to find a way to help them, and this was not the only dilemma that the military was faced with when dealing with the carriers. One military personnel recommended using carriers as frontline soldiers to fight the infected, an idea that was shut down immediately afterwards by his commanding officer. It was disagreements like this that led to the fall of Millhaven Military Base in the comic. Now, we don't have a comic telling us what the military was doing in New Orleans, but what we do know is that when it came to dealing with the carriers, they fell on the side of execution, which is all but confirmed in Chapter 3, where you find a pile of corpses inside the safe room. Nick will even chime in with,
Jesus, these are people. They were shooting people. I told you I had a bad feeling about this.
Now, the military isolating and executing carriers is bad, but I can assure you it gets worse. In Chapter 3, inside of a house, you can find text on the wall that reads as follows. 10 p.m. tonight, meet there, we go over the fence. It's suicide. The military is shooting to kill. They can't kill us all. Yes, they can. Later on, in another house, you can find more graffiti that reads like this. Sita abandoned us. The army fenced us up. We're not sick. If you can read this, the military cut us off. We have been left to die. And if you go to the second floor of the exact same house, you find this written on the wall. After reading this, it's pretty easy to piece together what happened. The carriers, knowing that they were likely going to be executed, decided to arm up and fight against the military. Now, I personally do not know if these survivors went through with their plan, but if they did, odds are they did not make it. And if that wasn't bad enough, large groups of survivors also started to fight against the carriers for their own safety. Remember, carriers can spread the infection by simply standing next to someone, so when the public found out just how dangerous carriers are, they decided to take matters into their own hands. It's also possible that at the start of the outbreak, large groups of survivors were supportive of the military's decision to kill the carriers, which again is all but confirmed in the safe room in Chapter 4, where you can find this conversation written on the wall. Don't break the quarantine line. If you help anybody from the compound, they won't evacuate you. There's nothing wrong with those people. Those are human beings over there. They're being shot at for nothing. They're being shot at to save you. They are infected. If you let them in, I'll kill you myself. And in the exact same safe room, we have one more piece of graffiti. God bless the military. No more Sita bullshit, lock and load. Thanks for nothing, Sita. Sita sucks. Carriers equal zombies. Kill all carriers. So, to sum everything up, we have three groups, the military, the survivors, and the carriers, all grouped up in New Orleans with the intent of finding safety, only to end up slowly killing each other over the span of a few weeks. Now, with our cast of survivors all being carriers, this does not bode well for them at all. And it's even worse when you realize that the crew from Left 4 Dead 2 likely has no idea what a carrier even is, which makes the ending of the Parish that much darker. Let's fast forward to the final chapter, the bridge. It's important to note that before you even leave the safe room, Nick and Coach will sometimes have this exchange.
Before we run across this bridge right toward the people who've been dropping bombs on us, anyone want to talk about a plan B?
Well, you free to make yourself a new life right here in this room, Nick.
All right, let's go.
After finding a walkie-talkie, someone from the military tells the survivors that a helicopter is waiting for them at the end of the bridge. It's also important to note that if you let the soldiers on the radios talk, they refer to the survivors as Whiskey Delta, which is the military's code word for infected. The survivors are able to make it to the helicopter and the bridge explodes just as they're flying off. Now, from this moment on, we have no idea what happens to the survivors, but it's always fun to speculate. And based on all the evidence we've seen throughout the parish, it's safe to say that the survivors likely didn't get the safe and happy ending that we were hoping for. Based on the evidence found in the parish, I think that one of two things happened to the Left 4 Dead 2 survivors. Either A, they were taken to a base to be tested on and later executed, or B, they skipped the test part and just flat out executed them. Now, I suppose there is a slim possibility that this specific military group in New Orleans may entertain the idea of using carriers as soldiers to fight the zombies, but that's wishful thinking. Also keep in mind that while they have their differences, this is almost exactly what happened to the survivors in Left 4 Dead 1. They get picked up in a military vehicle, but instead of being taken to a safe zone, they were taken to a base for testing. And the only reason they got out of Fort Millhaven alive is because of a disagreement between two commanding officers over their treatment of the carriers, which led to the alarm being sounded and the base being swarmed. Point is, the Left 4 Dead 1 crew got lucky. Very lucky, in fact. And it's safe to assume that the crew from Left 4 Dead 2 did not get as lucky, and that's the worst part about the ending of the parish. We have absolutely no idea what happened after this. No comic, no explanation, and we're likely not getting a sequel. The fate of the Left 4 Dead 2 survivors is completely up in the air, and while we can speculate and hope for a happy ending, the evidence throughout the parish does not point to that conclusion. And that is easily one of the most tragic parts about this campaign. The survivors spent weeks fighting through entire cities, carnivals, and swamps, all to reach the end goal that is New Orleans, but instead of being taken to a fort or a safe zone, they were likely taken to a lab and later executed. It's a very dark ending, but remember, we officially don't know and likely never will. The Parish is a very good campaign for many reasons, but its significance in the plot is what separates it from the other campaigns. Its genius use of environmental storytelling and the chilling dialogue between the survivors makes the Parish a one-of-a-kind experience. I did my best to scrape through every detail in the Parish, but if I missed anything, be sure to let me know. So with that said, what do you think happened to the survivors at the end of the Parish? If you made it this far, I really do appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one.